Chapter 806. Luonan slept, but he didn't sleep peacefully. The heat on his body followed him like a shadow. Even though he was in a cabin with a suitable temperature, the heat did not subside. In addition, his mind was overly tense. He seemed to have woken up twice in the middle. He looked at the download progress in a daze, confirming that the link still existed and that the progress bar was crawling at a tortoise speed. Only then did he fall asleep again. Oh, I think I went back to the tree hole once? In any case, the boundary between dream and reality had unknowingly dissolved in the end. A portion of his consciousness entered dormancy, but there was another portion that remained highly active. Or perhaps various brain regions took turns entering an excited state. Luonan gradually got used to this state. His consciousness went from being tangled and struggling at the beginning to becoming a matter of course. It extended and overflowed at will. There was no end to it. Luonan's soul strength was powerful. There were very few people who could match the depth and range of his senses. As long as he willed it, the entire earth and the cloud world would become his playground. Normally, under the control of reason, he would more or less have some misgivings. He needed to cultivate and research into configuration and other knowledge. He didn't have the leisure to let his mind wander. But right now, he was half asleep and half awake. He just wanted to be comfortable and at ease. How could he care so much? For a time, Luonan's consciousness flowed without restraint. It suddenly went to the east. It suddenly went to the west. It suddenly went to the sea. It suddenly went to the clouds. With the support of the soul cloak constructed by the condensation ring, he could move unimpeded as long as there was water vapor. He could travel thousands of kilometers with a single thought. Moreover, his mind instructs, in a second, was definitely not limited to this material world. There were 10 billion people on Earth. No matter how they were spread out like stars on a chessboard, separated by the sea and the sky, Luonan could see that their self-awareness was like water droplets popping and popping. Together, they converged into a vast ocean of the mental world. It was boundless, and there were few separations. This was a more interesting place than the real world. The circumstances of every second were completely different from the last second. Luonan had operated in the mental sea more than once before. For example, he used the dream-entering technique to construct a special dreamland. He guided and gathered information from all sides to form a psychic diagram. He obtained the miraculous effect of foresight. But this time, Luonan didn't possess a clear goal. He didn't even have clear cognition. He just endlessly wandered, expanding and contracting his consciousness. He was equivalent to a hairy child in a dream. He constantly moved his pillow and kicked his blanket to obtain a more comfortable position. His mental ocean was still too illusionary and unstable. It was like a misty maze where fluff was flying everywhere, but he lacked a blanket that could be gathered together. Luonan tossed and turned again and again, but he was unable to find that comfortable feeling no matter how hard he tried. He simply relied on himself. He spread out an enormous multidimensional spiderweb within the boundless and limitless void. Yes, he would obviously use the wraith sign system at this time. Luonan spread out the spiderweb of the altar, and the wraith sign resided in the center of the spiderweb. It was not the master, but it had become the mount of Luonan's consciousness. It climbed up and down within the spiderweb, entering and exiting the windows of everyone's hearts. It drew out the spider threads of desire, weaving an increasingly complex web. Desire was turbid and chaotic, and the corresponding consciousness was also chaotic and changeable. It did not possess any specific rules. Only when an external force deliberately guided it would it form a certain trend. This was not a time of war. Luonan's consciousness merely drifted according to its nature. Therefore, the spiderweb woven by the wraith sign did not activate the altar frame rule of victory notification, defeat withers. It just slightly drew in the sea of consciousness, allowing it to form a rough shape. This made Luonan feel a bit more comfortable. Luonan really did feel quite a bit more comfortable. The sea of consciousness that was drawn in by the spiderweb was filled with cool water vapor that enveloped him. Hold on. How could the emotions of living beings endlessly rise and fall and agitation become cool? Luonan intuitively felt a bit awkward. The side of reason that was alternating shifts displayed its use in a timely manner. It captured the crucial point that he had overlooked all this time. It wasn't that this side was too cold. It was that the other side was too hot. Oh, the sun was very poisonous. Luonan turned his head, and it was also in this instant that his soul shone under the blazing sunlight. In the unfathomable abyss far away in the void, the brilliant sun was like an enormous demonic eye. It stared straight at him. Light and heat were highly condensed and refined violent forces. Even though it passed through layers upon layers of barriers of space and time, it still possessed the destructive radiation that could burn the soul and the heart. The Wraith sign, who had appeared as a mount, was like thin ice under this brilliant and powerful light. It was like a faint shadow. It was hard for it to survive. It collapsed into a shapeless form, leaving Luonan alone. Oh, it's you. Why are you suddenly so lively? It seems like you've gotten quite a bit closer? Luonan was stupefied. He felt that this was quite absurd, so he laughed. The abyssal sun was silent. It just radiated boundless light and heat into Luonan's consciousness and desires, filling his soul with a unique restless power. You're the one playing tricks behind the scenes. Luonan didn't quite understand the details of his perception. He just felt a bit bloated. This was most likely due to the swelling of his mental plane. It allowed him to easily toss aside all apprehensions and shackles. He was fearless as he faced the blazing sun directly. He didn't just confront it. He even wanted to trace it backwards and see where the foundation of this demonic sun lay. This thought stirred in Luonan's mind. Then, his mind really did trace the brilliant light. It extended all the way to the distant void. It was unbelievably smooth. Oh, he seemed to have forgotten something? In any case, Luonan had a feeling that he and the abyssal sun had formed some sort of resonance. This was a power of internal connection. It was like the gravitational pull of the material universe. It penetrated the endless walls of the void and acted upon each other. Why? Walala. Walala. A familiar sound lingered in the surroundings. This was a listening question, and it was also a free-point question. The image of the heavily chained crow appeared in the depths of Luonan's consciousness in the first instant. The chains seemed to be forged from some unknown metal. It was the origin of Luonan's extraordinary power. It was the initial construction of formatting theory. It was also the materialization of the concept of "my heart's a prison." It was this materialization of extraordinary power that created something out of nothing. It subdued the Wraith sign with some sort of innate restraining power, giving Luonan the source of power to increase his power beyond the norm. And now, it transmitted this innate restraining power to the abyssal sun behind the layers of void. At least that was what it felt like. Also, Luonan himself had brought it over. His consciousness followed the extension of the heavily chained crow, rapidly approaching the abyssal sun. It felt like he was rapidly descending down a zipline. His speed grew faster and faster, and he could feel the blazing light and heat more vividly. At the same time, a rumbling sound reverberated in the vast and hazy void. It grew clearer and clearer, louder and louder, and grander. It was absolutely not an effect that could be formed by a single chain. Luonan's consciousness was in a state of unconsciousness. It was quite difficult for him to deal with the changes in speed, temperature, sound intensity, and other levels of information. In the end, he even felt dizzy. His consciousness went blank for a moment. By the time he connected the chains of consciousness, he had already entered an inconceivable world. The reason why it was a world was because it was big. It was indescribably huge and deep. The most dazzling thing within was undoubtedly the abyssal sun. It rolled, expanded, and shrunk. It sprayed out a terrifying flow of fire from time to time, and it caused the undulating flow of fire to form countless demonic and malevolent figures in the outer region. They were like living creatures. However, such an existence was not the main body of this world. Luonan's consciousness only paused on the sun for a moment before it shifted uncontrollably. It turned to other areas that the light could not illuminate. This other area was truly vast and boundless. However, this area was filled with layer after layer of dark chains. They were immeasurable, and the dark chains could not be seen from beginning to end. They weaved and crisscrossed, moving back and forth, interlocking with each other. They hummed and vibrated, converging into a harmony that made one's scalp go numb. They constructed a complex, dense, and boundlessly deep-sealed prison. They were the main body of this world. Perhaps they were the essence of the abyss. Luonan's own dark chains seemed to have fused into this sealed prison. It was the only end that could be seen, but it was also like the only loose slipknot. Well, this was just sleep talk. Luonan was probably awake now, but it was more like a dream than any other time. His consciousness merely wandered at the edge of the abyssal world. He was ignorant and shocked. Luonan had once viewed the core of his own format pyramid under Jim Master Shio's guidance. He had also seen the unique image of the dark chains densely woven. It was somewhat similar to the current absolute chain prison. However, the difference in scale and complexity of the interweaving structure was like the difference between heaven and earth. There was practically no meaning in comparing them. If Luonan were to force a comparison, then Luonan's was at most a crude model. Its degree of precision and rigor were inferior to even the most basic link node of this absolute chain prison. However, there was clearly an extremely close and direct connection between the two. Could this be the source of the power of my heart's a prison? I think I saw an amazing fellow. How could there be such a place in the universe? Where in the world was it? With Luonan's current level of strength, any conjectures were shallow and laughable when compared to this world. He was unwilling to engage in meaningless conjectures. His consciousness naturally extended outwards, attempting to copy down this grand, precise, and rigorous system for further research. Luonan's telepathic thoughts approached the depths of the abyssal sun wheel and the absolute chain prison. They grew clearer and clearer, allowing him to see more close-up scenes and understand more of the truth. There was no doubt that the sun wheel and the absolute prison were in constant conflict and confrontation. The absolute prison constructed from endless chains constructed the abyss, firmly imprisoning the sun wheel in its deepest depths. It compressed the space for its existence and weakened its life force. But during this process, every single chain endured a violent and blazing baptism of high temperatures. The detailed structure of the myriad chains was often shattered and then recombined. The recombined structure was different from before. It was as if the sun wheel had melted and even remolded them. Luonan was practically engrossed in this cycle of conflict and reconstruction. This was because he saw the supreme and deep configuration thinking within, as well as the incomparably vivid demonstration of the material. Every time it exceeded his imagination, it was just right. It was truly miraculous. A subtle and abrupt incongruity was embedded in at an inopportune time. It was like a dim mark that appeared on the bright and clean surface of the jade porcelain. Simple, crude, rigid, dilapidated. Luonan came up with 7 or 8 similar adjectives in an instant, but the most direct noun that followed nearly choked him. It was a spaceship parked at the edge of the abyss world. It looked as if it could collapse at any moment. It looked quite familiar. This was the basic information Luonan grasped in a short amount of time. He wanted to capture even more details, but when his telepathic thoughts crossed a certain boundary, his eyes suddenly blurred. Emptiness and turbidity. Colorful light flew chaotically. There was also an enormous tension and repulsion that accompanied the chaos. It nearly burst the structure of his consciousness. What configuration demonstration? What docked spaceship? Everything was destroyed. The vague feeling of forgetfulness that had always been at the bottom of Luo Nan's heart was flipped over at this moment. It brought back memories that had settled at the bottom of his heart. It was the experience of looking directly at the abyssal sun wheel last time. It was the time when the light of polar domain was created in a few months. The terrifying storm that originated from the abyssal sun wheel crushed through the distant space-time. If it weren't for the sealing power of the Dark Chains Dam, Luo Nan would have probably turned to ash within the raging flames of his emotions and desires. Even so, it was just a distant glance. Now, he was actually this close. I'm greedy. Luo Nan suddenly came to a realization. Everything he saw just now was perhaps just a certain point in the abyss world. Perhaps the opposing forces had reached a balance, a seemingly calm illusion. Right now, the illusion was shattered. The balance was broken. Everything entered a set state of violent distortion. Just how many details did he see just now? Just how much information was gushing out from those details in an explosive fashion? The magnificent scenery transformed into a dazzling and fatal shock wave in the blink of an eye. The structure of space-time was like a tattered rag sheet. Countless layers of twists and turns folded over each other. This warped power was released to even further space, to even more dimensions. Luo Nan's probing telepathic thoughts immediately turned into a high-voltage circuit. An indescribably enormous attack struck back like lightning, piercing through the frame of his body and soul. The power of the sun wheel and absolute hell, as well as the corresponding information, all poured into his brain. There was no doubt that the power of the backlash was extremely terrifying. And this time, the dark chains were no longer insulated. The only thing worth rejoicing about was that the power of the backlash pushed forward in a crushing fashion within the frame of Luo Nan's body and soul. The first thing it came into contact with was Luo Nan's mental plane. The power of the backlash was very terrifying, but the depth and breadth of this area was quite praiseworthy. It was like a meteor falling from the heavens. Below it was a vast ocean of icebergs, desolate and uninhabited. No matter how terrifying the impact and the killing power were, a large buffer and sedimentation would appear here. Of course, there would still be killing power when it overflowed. But there was another vast buffer zone outside the vast ocean of icebergs formed by Luo Nan's God Wheel. This was the sea of consciousness that Luo Nan's altar had gathered together. The emotions and thoughts of billions of living beings from all over the world were gathered within the sea of consciousness that was gathered by the spider web. They weren't good at anything else, but their enormous numbers and loose structure were like an enormous fluffy sponge. The powerful and surging power of the backlash and the corresponding flood of information were absorbed and digested layer by layer. Luo Nan was able to sense the dual power that came from the abyss world flowing within the spiderweb. It flowed over every node. It flowed over the living beings that were entangled on every knot of the web. The miraculous thing was that the altar's spiderweb, which was the supporting structure, directly withstood the attack. It didn't feel too much pressure. Instead, it went deeper and deeper as the power of the backlash deepened. The web was woven into the complex minds of billions of people, becoming even more dense and strict. Was it a misconception? It was like a wave of nutrients had been injected in. That was right. The structure of the altar's spider web originated from two forces. The first was the Wraith sign. It could already be confirmed that it originated from the projection of the abyssal sunwheel. The second was the framework of the altar. From what Luo Nan could see now, there was an 80 to 90% chance that this framework came from the absolute chain prison on the other side. In this way, there was the scorching heat and guidance from the abyssal sunwheel. There was also the harsh rules and control power from the absolute chain prison. They interweaved together. There was intense conflict, but there was also a subtle combination. This pair of equally grand forces clashed and cooperated. They were contradictory yet compatible. Within the sea of consciousness, within the living beings on the spider web, and even within the frame of Luo Nan's body and soul, they were drawn and spiraled, ever-changing. Well, the conflict was still mainstream. This caused the medicinal power of the nutrients to not be gentle enough. After the first wave of stimulating growth, the internal conflict quickly took the upper hand. It was only now that Luo Nan truly felt the pressure. The pressure and stimulation of this information that came from the abyss settled within the frame of his body and soul. It was also on the boundary of his thoughts. It was like a wave beating against the shore, pounding endlessly. Most of it was unable to reach the shore, but the ones that did hit the shore were like a flood that overflowed a dike. They drowned Luo Nan. Luo Nan was quite familiar with this. He had been facing a similar flood of information for the past few days. However, this flood was different from the chaotic fragments that he didn't know how to deal with. This wave of flood gradually eroded, seeped, decomposed, and absorbed within the spider web. Slowly, it became clear and logical, forming a vague framework of knowledge. Layer after layer of structure was piled up. Order. The most beautiful order. Even though it was heavy to the point of being hard to bear, it made one unable to stop. Luo Nan let out a long breath. His various planes of consciousness awakened one after another under the control of order. He unwittingly became completely clear-headed. He opened his eyes. The flat ceiling of the cabin was reflected in his eyes. There was also the blood-like sunset that penetrated through the porthole. The information of the material world was rich and vivid. It was most suitable for humans to receive and understand. It was just that Luo Nan turned a blind eye to it. Instead, he gave up the easy for the difficult. He went to decipher the enormous information structure that still settled within the frame of his body and soul, the altar's spider web. He made appropriate associations and extensions. Luo Nan naturally thought of his own situation. He was probably the primary martial arena of the conflict between the sun wheel and absolute prison in the spacetime of Earth. It had been going on for a very long time. The configuration system and the wraith sign system. Reason and emotions. Rules and chaos. Wasn't this the case? There was also the mist maze. The current Luo Nan could make a clearer judgment of the core area of the mist maze. Conflict, distortion, coexistence. It was very similar. Needless to say, there was also the broken spaceship, which could prove it on another level. There could be a lot of spaceships, but it was almost identical to the outer space spaceship, one of the two major satellites in the virtual brain interface. It couldn't have been a damn coincidence, could it? Everything was linked together. The abyss world was the source of everything. Once Luo Nan comprehended this, his understanding of the information of the mist maze naturally rose to a higher level. This was the essential reason why the spider web was able to digest and absorb the information. Oh, the altar's spider web structure itself seemed to be very suitable for a further understanding of the chaotic information of the mist maze. Machines and programs were unable to decipher information that was overflowing with contradictions and conflict. But life with spiritual intelligence, especially humans, seemed to be naturally prepared for this information. Actually, the vast majority of people did not possess the qualities to analyze complex information. But within the altar's spider web system, they were equivalent to lab rat. Luo Nan could observe the effects they received and make reverse deductions. From there, he could filter, precipitate, and wash out the most useful result. At this moment, Luo Nan's train of thought, which had always been unclear, became much clearer. Light flashed. Not good. There were far too many bursts of inspiration. He needed to memorize them all and go back to experiment with them one by one. Luo Nan wanted to get up and take notes, but he was unable to get up when he exerted force. The muscles and tendons involved in exerting force seemed to have completely lost their elasticity. They were sluggish and powerless. He took a deep breath and forcefully increased his strength. Finally, he raised an arm and placed it in front of his eyes. The cuffs of his sleeves were already drenched in sweat. The exposed arm was actually swollen by a size compared to before. His fair skin was now crisscrossed with blue and purple. Some of the subcutaneous tissues had already been destroyed, oozing with blood. This feeling, it was like someone had beaten him up while he was asleep. And so Luo Nan knew that the progress in the direction of the mist maze was not something that could be obtained casually. The frame of body and soul, especially the skeletal side, had already walked a full circle around the edge of the cliff. Luo Nan just raised his arm like this. He was a bit stunned. He wasn't frightened by the miserable scene. Instead, he thought of something else. In the past, he felt that the information of the double helix left behind by his old man did not completely and clearly explain the essence of the structure of the mist maze. He felt that the research was incomplete because he lacked the strength and time. But with this, his train of thought suddenly took a huge turn. If he possessed the preconditions of the external neuron, the real actions of the signal link, and the cultivation foundation of formatting theory were present, it seemed that he was close enough according to his current design. No, it was clearly too close. Why did he suddenly have such a dream? From the first half of the dream that he vaguely remembered, he could obtain an explanation. He had received the radiation of the abyss sun wheel for a long period of time. That was why he was drenched in sweat in the tree hole. He was restless and restless. His emotions were affected and interfered with. Also, the pulling power that came from the heavily chained crow was absolutely inseparable from the absolute chain prison, which was the opposite of the sun wheel. This was the gravity that came from the abyss world. Luo Nan had thought of every method possible to unearth the mysteries of the mist maze over the past few days. But he never expected that the more he analyzed, the closer he got to the abyss world. He also rapidly approached the taboo contained within. The truth was very beautiful, but one had to use one's life to decipher it. It was hard for him to hold on for long with his injured limbs. His swollen arm fell onto the tatami with a thud. There was no intense pain. He just felt numb and powerless. He could basically confirm that his nervous system had been injured. Due to the special nature of nerve cells, this was a very serious injury even for an ability user. It was even possible for him to become disabled. Luo Nan didn't really care about his own injuries. Instead, he thought of another old matter, an old matter that most likely no longer held any meaning. Perhaps on the other side, his father had suffered a loss? He wasn't too sure of his father's strength, but he knew that his father wouldn't be at the extraordinary level and wouldn't be stronger than him. He most likely wouldn't have the soul cloak or the altar spiderweb, which were blessed by the heavens. Then what about the gravity and impact that came from the abyss world? Luo Nan smashed the tatami again. Then he closed his eyes and muttered, "It's useless to think about these things. Next. Mr. Yin Luo, who was outside, heard the noise over here and asked in a low voice. Luo Nan didn't open his eyes, but Yin Li's current state was naturally reflected in his mind. She should have been waiting outside for quite some time. Her mental plane was fluctuating quite a bit. She probably had something she wanted to report, but she didn't dare to disturb him. Luo Nan heard a sound from inside, so he took the initiative to ask, "Come in." Luo Nan discovered that his throat was incredibly dry when he spoke. His voice had already changed pitch. The bamboo lattice door opened. Snake Tongue remained in a kneeling position outside. She feigned an inviting gesture as she invited Yin Lu inside. She grasped her posture quite well. But soon, Yin Li's startled cry caused the entire scene to collapse. "Mr." Yin Lu rushed inside, and Snake Tongue straightened her back from outside the door. She was stunned speechless. Luo Nan could roughly feel how bad his body's condition looked. He just hoped that it wasn't a bloody nose and swollen face. "Stop. It's not that serious." Luonan didn't want to create that sort of morning scene. He added a bit of soul strength, and his limp, exhausted body flipped over without the need for any muscles. It was as if he was in a gravity-free environment in outer space. Yinlu was stopped by his shout. She stopped walking, but her face was still deathly pale. Luonan's state just now was simply that of a swollen corpse. It really scared her. Behind her, Snake Tongue broke away from her shock a bit earlier than Yinlu. Her pitch-black pupils rapidly swept across Luonan's body, and her eyelids drooped down again. But then she bent her waist even more. Her forehead was nearly stuck to the tatami, expressing her attitude for not taking good care of him. "It's just a small hiccup. Don't worry." Luonan continued to comfort her. Yinlu blurted out, "Is it because of the sunlight nightmare?" Luonan blinked. "What's that?" "You." Yinlu spat out half of her words. Finally, her long years of experience as a secretary came into play. She forcefully suppressed the doubts in her heart and explained honestly, just an hour ago, a large-scale similar nightmare phenomenon appeared on the west coast of the new continent. According to current statistics, at least 100 million people dreamt of encountering the blazing sun, intense light, high temperatures, and other situations while they were sleeping. Luonan raised an eyebrow. Of course Yinlu saw it, but she could only feign ignorance. She continued, "Someone posted this experience online, and it caused a lot of agreement and reposts. It has already formed a trend of panic in the new continent. Since the incident has only been happening for a short period of time, the statistics are still ongoing. I'm afraid the number of people will rise by a large margin." Luonan asked, "Is it just the other side?" "No. From the looks of it, the west coast of the Pacific Ocean and even the old continent are experiencing similar situations. It's only because of the time zone factor. It's daytime, and the number of people sleeping is few, so it hasn't formed a large-scale effect. This is especially true on the plane of the inner world. Many ability users have given feedback, and the influence is even more prominent in the circle of orders. It's said that some orders that worship the sun have already begun to prepare for sacrificial activities over at Band City. Correspondingly, orders that worship the night, the moon, and other images have been impacted. I just heard that there have already been serious injuries caused by the backlash. I've also asked T-City. The Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District hasn't been impacted, but the number of believers that have been affected isn't small. However, the feedback is quite positive. Perhaps it's because the laws and principles of my religion don't conflict with the image of this wheel. Luonan slowly moved his fingers and evaluated. "It's a mess." Yes. Yinlu had previously suspected that the sunlight nightmare was highly related to Luonan. Now, she was even more suspicious. It was just that it had changed from a positive correlation to a negative correlation. In short, it was inextricably linked. Of course, she didn't dare to say it out loud. After she finished explaining the basic situation, she quietly listened to Luonan's opinion. The polar domain of the Abyss District hasn't been impacted. It's mainly concentrated on the plane of the mental sea, which is a level lower than the light of the polar domain. The same level and same source of power will also change. There was something Luonan didn't say. Compared to the light of the polar domain that had gone out of control, could this be considered a digestion in a certain sense? As he muttered to himself, Yinlu's eyelids twitched to the side. Due to her insufficient cultivation, she had only heard of the light of the polar domain several months ago. She didn't have a direct view of it. She only knew that it had caused an enormous shock in the upper echelons of the inner world. "Mister, can't you cover this up a bit? It's a global influence. As for Xia City, forget it. The way things are right now, it's shameful no matter what. I'll just pretend I don't know about it." Luonan's body gradually felt better during this period of time. As a result, his body felt more and more uncomfortable. He had been sweating from the time he fell asleep to the time he woke up. His sweat soaked through all of his clothes. After he turned over, the half-wet clothes that hung on his body slid against the surface of his body. They were a bit sticky. He really couldn't bear it. I want to take a bath. Chapter 807. No matter how Luo Nan's tone was, whether it was Yin Lu or Snake Tongue, they all treated it as an order to carry it out. 15 minutes later, Luo Nan was already submerged in the warm and slightly scalding hot soup. His back was leaning against the wooden wall of the pool, allowing the layers of heat to seep through the pores of his skin and flesh to permeate into his internal organs. As for whether or not this method was appropriate while he was injured, Luo Nan didn't mention it. Yin Lu and Snake Tongue didn't have the leeway to comment. It had to be said that the traditional bathing culture of Ban City was quite unique. Due to limited conditions, there was no hot spring on the yacht. But with Snake Tongue, who was born and raised in Osaka City and had been nurtured in traditional shrines for over 10 years, she was able to use the limited facilities to achieve a similar level of enjoyment. Under Snake Tongue's service, Luo Nan washed his body clean. Then he entered the narrow and small bathroom and soaked in the deep pool that could only fit 2 or 3 people. The ceiling above his head and even the deck above him were all opened up, revealing passageways that were like the walls of a well. The passageways led to the faintly dimming light of the sky. The claustrophobia and tranquility of being a frog in a well actually caused some philosophical thoughts to settle down. Luo Nan leaned against the wall of the pool, inhaling and exhaling warm water vapor. Behind him, Snake Tongue raised a wooden ladle and poured warm water from a bamboo pipe onto his shoulders and back. The change in temperature and the impact of the water continued to provoke the senses of his body. When he got used to it or became numb to it, there would be a strange tipsy feeling in his mind that quietly dissipated. "You really know how to enjoy life," Luo Nan mumbled with his eyes closed. The direction of his words was rather vague. It was unclear whether he was referring to the previous owner of the yacht or Snake Tongue, who was currently serving behind him. Through the mist, Yin Lu wanted to reply, but in the end, she felt that it wasn't appropriate and did not speak. She could only feel the awkwardness in her heart. The bathroom wasn't that big to begin with. The pool took up nearly 2/3 of the area. Snake Tongue was behind Luo Nan, watering the water, and Yin Lu was squeezed near the door. Especially since she was wearing a business suit that didn't match her appearance. She didn't wear shoes, and the steam had soaked her coat and her stockings. She looked a little embarrassed. What was even more annoying was the sullen feeling of working for someone else. The yacht she'd bought with her own hands had unexpectedly become Snake Tongue's home court due to Harmony Wind's renovation. The former witch's behavior was so natural and perfectly integrated with the current scene. It was as long as she was there, more exquisite and delicate enjoyment could be discovered. In this place, Snake Tongue didn't need to do anything. She only needed a sense of compatibility, to be able to crush her. Snake Tongue didn't need to do anything here. She could crush Snake Tongue. Snake Tongue still displayed a temperate attitude within the bathroom environment. Even though she was helping Luo Nan take a bath, she still wore a kimono. Her entire body was dressed in a strict manner. She didn't care if the steam in the bathroom made her clothes or hair wet. Water droplets condensed from steam slid down the surface of the kimono, the inner lining, the cheeks, and the neck, accentuating the delicate and white skin. On top of the neat bun, there was a thin layer of water, which gave it a porcelain-like enamel effect. Such a scene had already entered the category of art. Though a portion of the reality had been erased, wasn't this the sort of thing a youngster of Luo Nan's age liked? This was Luchen King Edge out. In this sort of environment, she intentionally or unintentionally used the contrast between intimate contact and formal attire to carry out some sort of hint. She probed Luo Nan's reactions and inclinations. Don't ask Yin Lu how she knew. The reality was that Luo Nan didn't express anything from beginning to end. Yet he didn't refuse such probing. He seemed to be enjoying it confidently and confidently. If it was a normal man, Enlu wouldn't have considered the obstacles of arrogance or modesty. But past experiences always proved that when she began to consider how to take the next step, this young man's state of mind had already entered an irrelevant and unconventional level of thinking. Unable to understand his thoughts, unable to feel his pulse, forever passive, unable to keep up. For a personal secretary who was motivated, facing such a boss was really stressful. Enlu was even thinking about studying the persona psychological analysis file a few more times to see if she could find any clues. According to the usual procedure, there should be a follow-up update to this set of information. If she really wanted to renew it, Enlu took a small breath, and the slightly choking water flowed out from her nose and throat. However, the heat still seeped into her internal organs, bringing an even heavier dampness and dryness. Sweat dripped down from her temples, sliding across her cheeks and onto her collarbone before sliding down. Her body was extremely greasy. The sound of water splashing in the room was extremely monotonous and noisy. It was truly unbearable. For an instant, she even wanted to push Snake Tongue, who was putting on an act, into the pool. She wanted to see what Snake Tongue would do when the time came. The sunlight nightmare. Pretty much everyone has a share. Yes? Enlu suddenly came back to herself and responded instinctively. She heard Luonan's muffled voice pass through the mist. He was indeed speaking to her. It mainly targets the turbid flow of the emotions and desires of living beings. There are many hidden stimuli, and it is somewhat related to the nature of the blood flame order's power. The abyssal region configuration isn't directly impacted, but the feedback from the masses will carry a bit, creating an indirect effect. Here it comes again. Enlu didn't know what expression she should use to face him. Her long years as a secretary had given her sufficiently excellent instincts. She immediately took the opportunity to take 2 steps forward. She ignored the wet ground and knelt down close to Snake Tongue. She pressed her knees to the ground and lowered her head to listen carefully. Yes, please guide me, Mr. Snake Tongue thoughtfully stopped watering at this time. She knelt upright to the side and served Luonan, causing the bathroom to become much quieter. Luonan's voice was still muffled, and it mixed together with the slightly undulating sound of the water. The lowest level of the magma lake is now equivalent to adding something. It will gain quite a bit of benefit for a short period of time. You can use it. However, pay attention to guiding and dispersing it. Don't let it flood your mind and explode your negative emotions. Enlu subconsciously responded, yes. But in the blink of an eye, her final words were stuck in her throat. He wasn't talking about the order. He was clearly talking about herself. She stood to the side, her emotions surging up and down. They actually didn't escape Luonan's eyes. It was hard for anyone to avoid palpitations and fear from being exposed like this. Her heart skipped a beat, but the compensating emotions that came surging up were unexpectedly peaceful. They were even mixed with a marvelous feeling of excitement. Yes, she and the Blood Flame Order were under Luonan's control for a long time. They were cowering under his inconceivable might. She was able to attract Luonan's attention. This proved that she possessed a certain position and meaning in Luonan's heart. She was quite lucky. Besides, what was so strange about having her thoughts seen through? Several months ago, when she was communicating with Luonan through Fei-Jin, hadn't she already been pierced through by this sharp edge? Also, she had experienced the mystical feeling of fighting across space with a true god and the others. Shouldn't the true meaning of God's understand be like this? Enli's other knee touched the ground. She allowed the overflowing pool water to seep into her stockings. She lowered her head deeply. I understand what you mean, sir. I will immediately go and make arrangements for T-City. Her voice was cut off again. This was because there was only a distance of half an arm between Enlu and Luonan. She could clearly feel the warmth of Luonan's body. She could hear his calm and drawn-out breathing. She could also hear his words that were close to a whisper. The power of chaos is still power. It's a waste to directly offset it. It's very economical to use certain rules to restrain and utilize it. It's very economical. The Blood Flame Order has already walked this path, but Mrs. Halder has walked even further. Since you have a foundation, you should use it. Think more and ponder more. Inla didn't quite understand. She could only respond with another yes. She prepared to ask Mrs. Halder for guidance later. Also, this place is a bit closer to Point B. Let's drive there. Sir, you want to go to the island? Inlo had already begun to adapt to Luo Nan's leaping thoughts. She quickly reacted. The so-called Point B was none other than Claw Island, the shooting range where Luo Nan practiced his exoskeleton control a few days ago. She was a bit hesitant. Sir, your current body. Just prepare a wheelchair. It's fine if you don't have one. Yes. The boss made a decision. Agreeing to it first was definitely the right thing to do. Then she heard Luo Nan continue to list out his request. I need around half a ton of consumables. Inla quickly did some mental calculations and responded, the island has enough in stock. However, I'll still need to transfer some to be absolutely safe. Luo Nan didn't say anything else. Inlu received the order, and her entire being was brimming with energy. She was no longer entangled in trivial matters. She quickly got up and left the bathroom. Right now, only Luo Nan and Snake Tongue were left in the bathroom. Snake Tongue adjusted her kneeling posture. She also used this opportunity to quietly adjust the rhythm of her breathing. She slowly entered the service station. This time, she was prepared to do something different. She heard Luo Nan murmur at this time. Just a bit more. There's also you. Snake Tongue. Snake Tongue originally wanted to maintain the persona of a person of few words, but now that she was called out, she could only respond in a low voice. Your Excellency? Who knew that Luo Nan wouldn't speak again? Snake Tongue couldn't check his pulse, but she had to speak no matter what at this time. Your Excellency, do you want me to give you a massage? Luo Nan still didn't speak. His eyes were still closed, but his chest rose and fell slightly. It seemed that he had fallen asleep amidst the dense steam. Snake Tongue could only assume that he had agreed. She dipped her hand into the pool of soup for a while, then stuck close to the surface of the water. She slowly moved up from Luo Nan's chest and ribs, using the warmth of her palm and fingers on his body. Right now, Luo Nan's skin was dark red from being soaked in the pool of soup. However, what was even more eye-catching were the crisscrossed bruises of green and purple. These were just the surface. There were some areas where Snake Tongue's fingertips streaked across. What should have been the taut skin of a young man was soft and collapsed. It was as if the skin had completely lost its elasticity. And so, Snake Tongue knew that Luo Nan's inexplicable injuries were far more serious than what was visible to the naked eye. Did he fight a great enemy through the air? Did something go wrong with his cultivation? Or did he delay the eruption of internal injuries from his battle with Gong Qi? A few speculations flashed through her mind. The rhythm of Snake Tongue's massage wasn't affected in the slightest. Only her fingertips became sharper. They alternated between the intact and the damaged body. She didn't need to deliberately mull over it. The knowledge accumulated from her many years of cultivation formed a rather precise image of the human body in her mind. Where it was tough and where it was weak, she could see it with a single glance. Chapter 808. Luo Nan really did seem to have fallen asleep. His breathing grew longer and longer. Snake Tongue slightly straightened her waist, letting the back of Luo Nan's head rest against her chest. Her fingers moved to Luo Nan's temples, gently rubbing them. From Snake Tongue's perspective, the sleeping Luo Nan completely exposed the face of a young man. The slight swelling caused by his injuries dispelled the only sense of seriousness that came from his habitual frown. Such a young man was 16 or 17 years old. He hadn't even passed puberty, but he was already one of the strongest people in the world. He possessed the mighty power of a god, and he firmly grasped her fate of life and death. But right now, this young man's mind was hazy. He had hidden injuries all over. It seemed that all she needed to do was exert a bit of force with her 2 fingers. Some restless flames were instantly frozen by ice-cold reason. But Snake Tongue's fingers still showed some stiffness. Even in the hot and humid bathroom, cold air seeped out of her fingertips. Luo Nan's eyelids trembled slightly at this time. Then he slowly opened his eyes, but his gaze was unfocused. It was as if he was cast into an unknown dimension. Snake Tongue's rubbing movements were nearly frozen to death. Her long years of acting had tempered her top-notch acting skills, as well as her powerful control and expressive ability. This helped her maintain her current persona of a perfect servant, allowing everything to continue according to normal logic. Snake Tongue was confident in her acting skills. She could vividly play any role in the world, and she could play the perfect version of herself. The problem was that even the world's top acting skills were unable to control the thoughts that flashed through one's mind. Unfortunately, the person in her embrace possessed the divine power to point directly at one's heart. A second later, or perhaps longer, Luo Nan's voice rang out. Your talent in cultivation is better than Yin Li's. You're better than many people. Much better. I already knew this back at Ocean Sky Cloud City. Snake Tongue's rubbing movements finally froze. She held her breath. I just had a concept regarding coupling. I recklessly experimented with it, and you were able to sort out a logical outline. You're truly amazing. Luo Nan was undoubtedly reminiscing. He was reminiscing about his first encounter with Snake Tongue several months ago in Xia City. Snake Tongue didn't know why, but this was absolutely not what she wanted. The problem was that she couldn't even control her own thoughts, let alone block Luo Nan's thoughts. Back then, you didn't call me Lord. You called me, what? Lord Luo. There were a million things in Snake Tongue's heart that she didn't want to say, but in the end, she could only obediently spit out the answer. Her voice was unprecedentedly hoarse. Luo Nan was still leaning in her embrace. His eyes were unfocused, and his murmur sounded like he was talking in his sleep. But when it fell into Snake Tongue's mind, it was like thunder rolling from the depths of the clouds. So, we started off as enemies. You, puppeteer, and that tank destroyed the legacy of my mother's designs. And I threw you into the cloud world. There, you were enslaved by Gong Qi, and you slowly tasted the taste of weakness and death. Snake Tongue's body began to tremble uncontrollably. At the same time, an unfathomable fear expanded in his body. It was like the surging clouds in the world of clouds. It carried a blood-colored poisonous light as it corroded his internal organs, limbs, and bones. No, she didn't want to go back to that state. Never. But what could she do? As a newly attached believer, or rather, a captive, what should she do? What could she do? All external decorations were meaningless. The more perfect the acting, the weaker the heart. Luo Nan's whisper continued to linger beside her ear. You're very chaotic. A terrible starting point. A terrible process. And a seemingly acceptable result, yet it's still an extremely terrible result. You've survived, but you didn't survive in the way you wanted. You're unyielding. You must be very unwilling. Right now, it was impossible for Snake Tongue to maintain her current posture. She used all of her strength to maintain the rhythm of her movements. She carefully leaned Luo Nan's body against the edge of the pool, and she broke away from him. She retreated, then she knelt on the ground. Her forehead made contact with the wet floor. She didn't open her mouth again because it would be wrong no matter what she said. She could only use this method to display her own humbleness and submission. Luo Nan's murmur continued to enter her ears amidst the hot and humid steam. It seemed that he was a bit tired from speaking, and his voice became even weaker and more vague. Your method is superior to Yin Li's. Etiquette is an external order. It can restrain emotions, but it doesn't go as far as to greatly neutralize the true strength in the heart. There has always been a flame burning in the bottom of your heart. The stricter the etiquette, the more intense the flame. This is very good. There was an instant when Snake Tongue's entire body went numb from top to bottom. It was as if she had lost all perception of her body. Only the heat and burn that burst forth from her chest was so clear and real. It was also at this moment that Snake Tongue tasted the flavor within. It was fear. It was resentment. It was hatred. It was restlessness. It was unwillingness. It was everything she was unable to dispel in this lowly situation. It accumulated and coiled to the point of smoldering poisonous flames. It was like the burning coal seams underground or the roaring magma. It smelted her soul, causing it to transform into an appearance that she herself was unable to distinguish. But the important point was that such a warped and blazing soul gushed out a power that even Snake Tongue herself was unable to control. Yet it was grasped by a peerlessly powerful hand from outside, stroking and toying with. A deep despair covered her nose and mouth, suffocating her. Luo Nan's voice dispersed amidst the steam. There were practically no fluctuations in his tone. He spoke in a flat and straightforward manner, describing the fact. You are polite, temperate, and obedient. You use etiquette to regulate and sublimate them. You are close to pious. The word pious is very good. This form is also very good. However, your self-awareness isn't clear enough. You said it yourself. The orders here in Ban City all know what the god they worship is. Therefore, there isn't much piousness to speak of. I've also read a few similar books and articles. As long as a god is worshipped, the distance between the two sides must be pulled apart. It's best if the believers are ignorant. Piety is an unequal mental state. In this era, especially the ability users of this era, being able to be pious to certain concepts, certain abstract supernatural powers is already the limit. It's too hard for them to treat the god by their side like this. Moreover, I'm far from being considered a... Then there was a knock on the door at this time. Inlo reminded him from outside the door, "Mister, everything is ready." Luo Nan's train of thought was interrupted, but he didn't mind. He went, "Oh. Then it's fine to stop here." Inlo thought that Luo Nan had finished his bath, so she pushed open the door and entered. She had prepared a wheelchair outside the door. However, she was stupefied when she saw the situation in the room. Her gaze turned to Snake Tongue, who was lying on the ground. She resisted her curiosity and listened to Luo Nan's instructions. Luo Nan used his soul strength to drive his body and stood up from the hot spring. "Let's go. Hurry up and tidy up your body." Inlo rushed forward to support him. Snake Tongue, who was lying on the floor, was stunned for 2 seconds before she absent-mindedly got up. She completely followed her instincts and did what she had been doing before. It seemed that she would continue doing in the future. Before today, Luo Nan had never encountered such a situation. He had bared his body in front of 2 beautiful women. He was like the slave masters of ancient times, enjoying meticulous service down to his hair. However, the speed at which he entered the state exceeded his expectations. There was still some awkwardness and deliberate restraint before the bath, but now it had already turned into nothingness. Of course, he had never seriously experienced anything. Most of Luo Nan's energy was placed on the sunlight nightmare, the source of this phenomenon, the abyss world, and the intermediate process of the evolution of the two. He had observed the abyss world and even experienced the effects of the backlash. Right now, his brain had quite a few bursts of inspiration. Unfortunately, none of them matured. Once he entered the practical domain, he would more or less be lacking. And these were just insignificant sprays and droplets of the torrential flood of information. There were many more valuable things. They were all buried in the filtering nets of the soul cloak and the altar's spiderweb. It was hard to find a trace of them. If he forcibly searched, his consciousness would unconsciously move toward the abyss world. He would feel the gravitational effect. Luo Nan didn't know the gravity of the situation. He didn't have the courage to do another wave in a short amount of time. Therefore, he cast his gaze toward the outside world. The other side of the Pacific Ocean was the area that suffered the most from the Sunlight Nightmare's attack. However, Luo Nan had already observed that the attack was too tyrannical. The effects and feedback were rather monotonous. On the other side of the old continent, the effects were incorporeal and ever-changing. There was great value in observation and research. Yin Lu and Snake Tongue were both targets of his observation. As for the results of the observation, there weren't any surprises on Yin Lu. Her years as a secretary had made her sharp and tactful, so she naturally tended to treat her boss as the key. Even if there were some stimuli, she would swiftly dissolve them without any qualitative changes. On the other hand, Snake Tongue, a beautiful and obedient woman on the surface, hid an almost instinctive, untamed strength in her heart. The exuberant emotions that were suppressed in the deepest part of his heart and the calmness and rationality that had been polished for years were a special portrayal of the blend of chaos and order. If one were to look at it with colored glasses, they would even vaguely see the checks and balances between sun and hell. Something as big as the Sunlight Nightmare had finally left some traces in this world. That was good. Luo Nan decided not to provoke Snake Tongue for now. Snake Tongue needed to digest the emotional impact she had revealed. He also needed to make further observations and interpretations. Don't look at how his previous psychological analysis was straightforward and incisive, hitting the nail on the head. Luo Nan still had a smattering of knowledge when it came to the deepest parts of human psychology and emotions. He always felt that he was lacking a bit. He was separated by a layer. He was unable to touch it. The more it was like this, the more he couldn't let go of a special case like Snake Tongue. Wasn't this a bit excessive? But among the pile of believers, there was only one example of an enemy transforming into a believer, Snake Tongue. For such a dangerous experiment with unpredictable consequences, why didn't he look for her? Luo Nan's mind spun 2 more times. The more he spun, the more he felt that it was natural and right. Oh, the more he spun, the more inexplicably delighted he felt. How should he refer to it? The exquisite and treacherous changes that came from the bottom of his heart troubled Luo Nan a bit. Perhaps he needed to read a few related monographs or consult a veteran like Mr. Bai. Chapter 809. Under the service of the 2 beautiful women, Luo Nan quickly took care of his appearance. He wore a bathrobe and sat in a wheelchair. Yin Lu pushed him out of the bathroom. Actually, the wheelchair was electric, but Yin Lu was willing to push him, so Luo Nan let her. Yin Lu seized the time to give a more detailed report after arriving in a domain that was more suitable for her. The yacht will arrive at the pier of Claw Island in approximately 7 minutes. Mister, do you want to go directly to the island? Yes. Then let us help you change your clothes, mister. Oh, no need. In any case, we probably won't be able to stay. Just go directly. Yes. Yin Lu was used to these kinds of instructions. Plus, she felt that the temperature of Ban City in May was acceptable, so she didn't say anything more. As for Snake Tongue, she was even more silent than before. The kimono on her body was half wet and a bit messy, but she didn't cut a sorry figure. At least she didn't look that way on the surface. She followed the style of a traditional Ban City woman. She walked forward with small steps, reserved and humble. Who could know that there was a ball of poisonous fire rolling in her heart, but it was sealed in the ice of reason, burning in despair. Even though Luo Nan was the one who set the question, he was unable to detect any clues from Snake Tongue's tranquil expression just by looking at her from the outside. In an extremely short amount of time, Snake Tongue had already grasped the basics of losing control of her emotions. She suppressed them so that they wouldn't interfere with her reason. At the same time, she continued to provide a stimulating power. Of course, as Snake Tongue completed all of this, the altar spiderweb constructed an even more complex and profound control structure in her mind. Not only did Luo Nan's control over her not weaken, it actually increased. This can be considered my work, right? Truly amazing. Luo Nan didn't know if he was praising Snake Tongue or praising himself. He tilted his head to size up Snake Tongue, but in the end, he adhered to his previous plan. He didn't stimulate her further. The three entered the elevator and went to the upper deck. Inlu received a phone call in the elevator. It came from the cockpit of the yacht. She was a bit surprised and hung up after a few words. She leaned over and reported to Luo Nan, "Mister, there are surveillance planes operating in the airspace surrounding Claw Island. They belong to the Coastal Defense Forces of Band City. They just asked for the identification number of our yacht. It seems that they are carrying out a search mission. They also informed us that if necessary, they will board the ship for inspection. Please cooperate." Coastal defense? Luo Nan scanned the area with his telepathic thoughts, and he more or less understood the surrounding environment. It was already late at night in Band City. There were many clouds and stars, and the surface of the lake was dark and gloomy. It was relatively quiet. Within a radius of 10 kilometers, apart from the low hum of the yacht's motor, there were only two unnatural noises: a cruising aircraft 700 meters above the side, and a small submarine 50 meters below the surface of the lake, 7 kilometers away in a straight line. If one were to expand the scope a bit, there would be approximately 100 or so people in the northern mountain lake region. They were all military personnel armed with real guns and ammunition. They were equipped with 2 units of deep blue walkers, and they were seething with murderous intent. It has nothing to do with us. Luo Nan didn't discover any experts among the military personnel. He didn't discover any targeted hostility. Finding trouble with him with this kind of equipment was simply a joke. It would be too exaggerated to say that this was a probe. Inlo thought so too. Maybe they're searching for fugitives. The northwest of Beishan Lake was also considered a wilderness area. There were mountains everywhere, and the terrain and people were equally complicated. In this case, it was normal for the military to intervene without the Metropolitan Police Department's permission. They can indeed board the ship for inspection. It's an official act, so it's hard for us to refuse. But it's nothing. I personally entered the country normally. Snake Tongue's identity can withstand inspection. The yacht's procedures are complete. We signed a temporary lease agreement with the Explorers Society of Band City over at Claw Island. As for you, sir, even if you were to stand in front of them, they might not be able to discover you. What was up with Yin Li's confidence? Was she trying to flatter him? Luo Nan was amused by her. Yin Lu took the opportunity to suggest, "Sir, we can block most reconnaissance methods on the ship. But if we board the island now, we will be exposed to the enemy's surveillance. Shouldn't we wait a bit?" Wait? Luo Nan frowned. He wasn't willing to disrupt his plans, but then again, the entire day of competing with the Abyss world seemed to be outside of his plans. "Your Excellency can also help the military speed up their progress." Snake Tongue spoke unhurriedly. She lowered her eyes and brows when Luo Nan shifted his gaze over. It seemed that the words just now had nothing to do with her. Snake Tongue's current mental state was very subtle. It seemed that she had broken through something, but she was obediently restrained. Luo Nan's interest in this aspect far exceeded that of the military's search and capture operation. Oh, Snake Tongue's suggestion was indeed clever. If it really was an extremely vicious criminal, Luo Nan didn't mind helping the military out. Everyone would disperse sooner, and their hearts would be clean. Luo Nan's mind had already circled North Mountain Lake 80 to 100 times as he thought this. However, the latest news traveled a bit faster than his thoughts. Inlu received the latest news. It was hard for her to conceal her bewilderment. "Sir, the military has informed us that they are no longer boarding the ship for inspection. It seems that the mission has ended. They've already withdrawn." Luo Nan asked curiously, "Did they catch the criminal?" Luo Nan's curiosity was piqued during the time Inlu was stuck. His mental senses had already covered the entirety of Band City, and he had increased his resolution by a large margin. His perceptual strength was like an enormous fishing net being cast down at this moment. It was spread out like a cloud of smoke, and when it was drawn in, it grabbed an ocean's worth of information. The information covered multiple dimensions of the mental and material planes. The amount of information he received in an instant was enormous, but compared to the trillions of fragments in the mist labyrinth, the flow of information originating from the real world and the rules of society was simply smooth and orderly. He swallowed it in a single gulp, and it was digested in the blink of an eye. Cough, this was an exaggerated description. Luo Nan wasn't stupid enough to search and analyze item by item. He just grabbed a high-resolution comparison photo of the beginning of the term and the end of the term. After a slight comparison, there was a clear difference between chaos and order. 10 seconds ago, a fire, 2 to 3 violent crimes, 5 car accidents, over 100 quarrels, nearly 1,000 noises, and several tens of thousands of drunkards had occurred in the surroundings of Ban City. There were no abnormalities in all of this. The residual energy that caused injuries and death was scattered all over the coast. There was a location on the northern shore of North Mountain Lake, and a dozen locations deep in the mountains. Among them, there were 3 locations that involved military weaponry. There were 2 locations on the coast, and there was one on the northern shore. This was probably the result of the military's efforts. Luo Nan didn't possess the ability to rewind time, but he was able to perform positioning and analysis from the vibrations of the particles in the atmosphere and the eruption of emotions in the sea of consciousness. The amount of information involved in such a method was quite astonishing. But Luo Nan wanted to say that any information that could be organized and explained wasn't a problem at all. Luo Nan's interest was piqued, and he thoroughly understood the situation. Enlu wasn't idle either. She made a few phone calls and obtained an answer. She hesitated for a moment before moving closer to Luo Nan. "Mister, I've obtained information from another channel. The military's operation is public. It said that they were hunting down an important figure of an illegal order. The operation has already ended. There's an illegal order in Ban City." Luo Nan couldn't help but chuckle twice. He spoke of the results of his observations in passing. 2 are dead, and 1 is captured. Enlu did her best to maintain a matter-of-fact attitude. She didn't want to be so useless. But after digging out the follow-up information, she really didn't feel good in her heart. According to the military's report, that illegal order is the Soul Order. Soul Order. Luo Nan felt that the name sounded familiar, but he didn't react in time. It wasn't until he sensed Enli's awkward mood that he suddenly realized something. The Soul Order. The one that killed Black Wolf. Yes. Enlu couldn't say anything more. This was because she was one of the cold spectators when Black Wolf was killed. Luo Nan never had any formal contact with the Soul Order, but they had bad intentions towards him. Last year, not long after Luo Nan rose to prominence due to the cage theory, this order secretly executed a scheme. They used the doctrine of the immortal soul to send out a character called Fantasy Fire to lure and kill Black Wolf, a member of the Xia City branch's operations team. Fantasy Fire used a bizarre possession technique to occupy Black Wolf's body. They attempted to break into Luo Nan's circle of friends and conspire against him. Their methods were extremely covert. The Xia City branch, including Luo Nan, were all kept in the dark. However, perhaps there was a need for cooperation, but Fantasy Fire's luring and possession operation against Black Wolf turned into a business demonstration. The middleman was the LCRF Xia City manager, Sun Jie. The client was the Bloodflame Order. Enlu was the one present at the time. It wasn't a big deal at first, but everyone present at the time, including Enlu herself, never expected that she, Mrs. Halder, and even the entire Bloodflame Order would completely lean towards Luo Nan in a few short days. In this way, the secret became a joke. The incident came inexplicably and left abruptly. Fantasy Fire, who had taken over Black Wolf's body, was personally captured by Ouyangchen. However, Fantasy Fire's soul was in a special state. His soul was completely extinguished the moment he was stimulated intensely. He didn't leave any clues behind. Sun Jiai was controlled by the Xia City branch. She confessed to this matter without reservation, but she didn't reveal any valuable information to the Soul Order. She was only a middleman, and her identity was special. The LCRF and headquarters exerted quite a bit of pressure on her. She was currently under surveillance, and there was no further news for the time being. The Soul Order's conspiracy came to a screeching halt in Xia City. The Xia City branch informed the various powers of the inner world of the Soul Order's information and method. It would have been better if they hadn't informed the Soul Order. Once the news got out, all sides made a summary and analysis, and the situation suddenly escalated. It turned out that Luonan wasn't the only target of the Soul Order. Many powerful and famous ability users of the inner world had become their target. Their methods were very similar. They all attacked the outside first, and then they gradually infiltrated. In this way, there were nearly 100 innocent victims, not to mention the main target. Their goals were vague. Their motives were unclear. They attacked fiercely right from the start. This sort of order was an illegal organization. Overnight, this pheasant order, which didn't have much of a reputation, became the target of everyone's curses. Especially at the beginning of the year, they were simply the public enemy of the world. Regardless of whether it was the inner world or the secular world, news about them repeatedly appeared in the newspapers. Luonan paid attention to them for a few days at first, but later, he threw himself wholeheartedly into the study and research of configuration. He pondered over how to kill Gong Qi with a single thought, and he soon became desensitized. He was quite surprised when he heard the news today. They haven't been exterminated yet? The military has taken over handling it. I think that there are very few ability users left. Perhaps they're the remnant. Forget it. I don't care about them. Luonan had no interest in delving into the matters that had already been determined. The yacht was already docked at Claw Island's pier. He had more pressing matters to attend to. Chapter 810. Luonan refused Yin Lu and Snake Tongue's wishes to accompany him. He ascended the island by himself. The electric wheelchair traveled on the barren, flat, and hardened road. Soon, he arrived at the storage warehouse that he needed for his daily practice. Here, aside from the exoskeleton armor parts that could be replaced at any time, there were the military's energy bars, nutritional fluids, and some compound powders. They were arranged neatly in different storage bins, ready to be used at any time. Next to the storage warehouse was the Field Energy Center on Claw Island. This layout did not conform to safety regulations, but it met Luonan's actual need. Right now, the energy center was equipped with a superconducting generator set. It operated tirelessly under the dual drive of wind and water. It provided an unending stream of electricity to the entire island base. It should be enough. Luonan compared the specific consumption of his previous practice and had a plan in mind. After all the prerequisites were met, he leaned against the back of the wheelchair and maintained a comfortable posture. He closed his eyes and cast his telepathic thoughts behind the layers of void barriers. The misty world, the misty maze, the tree-hole space. Luonan's telepathic thoughts flowed unimpeded. He smoothly made contact with the information of the external neuron floating above the lens. The feedback information made Luonan spit out a turbid breath. He had been wondering whether or not the signal link between the external neuron and the corresponding flying ship would be a bit more stable after a round of intimate contact had been realized. Reality was cruel. The downloading process of the offline test question library had yet to end. The careful inspection of the interface information had even been interrupted for a considerable amount of time. And this phase was precisely when the backlash of the Abyss world erupted. It was very clear that the outer space flying ship and the Abyss world were not the same thing, even though they were close. The fluctuations of the abyss world formed a clear interference with the signal transmission of the flying ship. From this perspective, Luo Nan's previous torment did not make up for his losses. He just gained an additional analytical train of thought in name, and it was the type of logic that was fragmented. Also, when Luo Nan recalled the scene of the flying ship in his half-dream and half-awake state, he could not help but be a bit worried. It seemed that the artificially created object was about to reach its limit, and it had been suspended in the zone of limits for a long time. How long could it persist? He was unable to guess. He could only think like this: if it stayed there for a dozen years, a few decades, then it shouldn't be hard to persist for a period of time. Right? Luo Nan was destined to be unable to obtain an answer. He could only sigh and use his telepathic thoughts to turn the external neuron into a wisp of electricity. It penetrated the void barrier and returned to his brain. With the additional layers of space barriers, the signal link was disgracefully cut off. The download progress was interrupted, and it seemed to be rewound. Luo Nan had no choice. There was nothing he could do. Luo Nan adjusted his body with difficulty. The bathrobe on his body scraped against the armrest of his wheelchair, causing it to come off a bit, revealing his chest and abdomen. It was right between his chest and abdomen. It was hard to see with the naked eye, but if one touched it, one could feel a rather strange, deformed area. His skin was slightly protruding, and it did not have the feeling of his sternum and muscles. It was more like a tumor that had been embedded in it. This was the night-grade basic colonization biochemical reactor that had been implanted. In the past, the reaction furnace had only provided external cellular tissues for use in the electromagnetic muscle membrane structure. But at this moment, when Luo Nan's muscles and bones were hurting, a new and classic value was manifested. There was a light explosion. The simple electric discharge device installed at the corner of the warehouse blossomed with dazzling blue electric flames. It was as if it pierced through the air and went straight for Luo Nan. In fact, the external neuron had come into play at the right time. It became the most stable and efficient power transmission line. An unending stream of electricity was transmitted over. The electricity was transformed by an electromagnetic configuration to drive the operation of the biochemical reactor. Under the stimulation of energy, Luo Nan's multipotent stem cells, which had been sealed in the incubation chamber of the furnace for a long time, began to differentiate and proliferate. They quickly formed the various tissues and cells needed by Luo Nan's wounded body. At the same time, the biochemical reactor extended out countless tentacles. They touched every area of Luo Nan's wounded body at practically the same time. They followed the long-coupled rules of the body and soul framework of the body gear and the God gear to repair the subcutaneous tissues and various internal organs. In the end, they even directly reconstructed a main artery. Under the impact of the backlash, a nearly necrotic spinal nerve completely replaced the damaged nerve cells. The replacement waste was not wasted at all. It was directly absorbed into the biochemical reactor to be processed and reused. During this time, Luo Nan constantly extracted consumables from various storage boxes. He extracted various nutrients needed for the growth of human tissues from within. Actually, different elements required different processing and absorption methods. The formulas and processing techniques were all very particular. Unfortunately, there were no finished products on Earth. Luo Nan did not have the ability to perform fine processing for the time being. He could only make do with what he had. He did not care about wasting anything. And so, a top-notch neurosurgery operation was carried out silently under the clumsy logistical support. The entire process was complex and smooth. It was as if an experienced and highly skilled medical team or engineering team was stationed within Luo Nan's body. Cutting-edge equipment. It's really infuriating. When Luo Nan opened his eyes once more, his body could be considered to be brand new. What the biochemical reactor did in a short few minutes had already formed a crushing suppression of Earth's technology. He could not help but think of an opponent of the same level. One had a biochemical reactor implanted within his body, while the other didn't. At the very least, there would be a difference of heaven and earth in their ability to continue fighting. They were not on the same level at all. Should I rejoice that the spaceship plunged into the abyss world and not some place on Earth? Humph. There's also Li Wei. Of course Luo Nan would not forget that this equipment was something he had snatched from Li Wei's tiger's mouth. There was an 80 to 90% chance that there would be similar equipment over there. But in any case, the established facts brought him more joy. There was no benefit in thinking too much. Luo Nan just needed to know that the biochemical reactor was very useful to him now, and it would be very useful in the future. The coupling effect of Luo Nan's body and soul frame was like that of a gear set. The large wheel carried the small wheel. Even if the teeth were extremely good and the lubrication was extremely good, the small wheel would still wear and tear after a long period of operation. Needless to say, the difference in specifications between the two wheels was far too great. Even though he normally had the soul cloak, the sandwich domain, and other similar reservoirs to adjust, the backlash damage to his body would be quite severe if he were to go all out in an emergency situation. Now that he had the biochemical reactor, some of his internal injuries could be repaired in a timely manner. It would not accumulate over a long period of time and lead to unpredictable consequences. Luo Nan thought deeper. The body and soul frame he had constructed several months ago based on the concept of coupling still had areas that needed to be perfected. There was still room for adjustments. The dichotomy between the body and the spirit was too crude. Magnified to a broader system, the effect between the two was not as simple as the mutual interference between matter and consciousness. Instead, one had to consider the harmonious relationship between order and disorder, rules and chaos, controllable and uncontrollable. Tsk, he had naturally entered into the frame of the abyss world. Luo Nan did not want to court death, so he stretched his back on the wheelchair. He was not in a hurry to get up. After all, the tissues of his body had just grown, especially the nerve cells that included his spinal nerve. He needed to continue working together. Right now, there were still some problems with his coordination. It was always better to be conservative and cautious. He used the wheelchair as a means of transportation. He patted the armrest, and a miniature motor silently drove him out of the warehouse. But he only advanced 2 or 3 meters before he lost all power. He could not respond. Oh my brain is screwed. Luo Nan had only cared about recovering from the injuries on his body. He had forgotten about the powerful electromagnetic field controlled by the electromagnetic configuration. It was directly harmful to electronic product. The precise spare parts in the warehouse were all protected by sealed anti-magnetic cases. He could ignore them. The electric wheelchair beneath his buttocks was in big trouble. The battery, wiring, and chip were a complete mess. Even if Luo Nan was a professional and had the external neuron in his hands, he would not be able to save it in a short time. In the end, it still needed to be driven by human power. Luo Nan curled his lips. He used the strength of his soul to add power to the wheelchair. The wheelchair under him started up once more, and he smoothly exited the warehouse, heading toward the dock. The wheelchair stopped once more after advancing 20 to 30 meters. This time, it was not a problem of power. Luo Nan stopped in the spacious and barren open space. He frowned. Old Kong breathed in small mouthfuls. His lips were trembling due to the excessive pressure. He choked on the rust-smelling blood and engine oil, blocking his throat and causing him to suffocate. Fortunately, the life support system switched over in time, entering a low-energy consumption state. His vision dimmed, and all the images switched to display data. Only the secret passageway under Claw Island was clear. He did not exert any force with his body. The fish skin wrapped around his body relied on its special structure to borrow the power of the water flow to gradually approach the target point. His consciousness grew more and more fuzzy. He was trapped in a rusty shell, and the driving force he should have lost rapidly. Without the amplification of the shelter, it was too strenuous for him to move the fish skin outside by relying on his own strength. But if he did not strictly follow the emergency handling regulations and reset his soul frequency band at regular intervals, he would have been a step ahead in escaping from the shelter. Perhaps he would have been caught in one fell swoop like the others. The enemy was breaking the soul frequency band faster and faster. The old-fashioned shelter had already become the root of disaster. It was completely exposed under the enemy's eyes. The problem was that, just like the predicament he was currently in, without the augmentation of sanctuary, they, who lacked talent, would lose even the most basic ability to resist. That demon clearly had a terrifying and overwhelming advantage, but he still infiltrated layer by layer, toying with them in the palm of his hand. How could there be such a person in this world? No, he did not belong to this world. Old Kang's consciousness grew more and more chaotic. Blood seeped out of his 5 senses, 7 orifices and pores. He twitched like an electric shock. A serious disorder had already appeared between the original human system and the modified system. Their functions and structures began to intersect and reject each other. Perhaps he was going to die. He was definitely going to die. But he had yet to rise from the well. As an old miner, he still needed to dig a few more meters. It was not because of the cold mechanical supervisor, nor was it because of the high radiation rare mineral resources. It was all for the soul, for the complete soul. At the same time that his consciousness became clear, a parameter changed on the life support system interface. There was no other notification. The fish skin and Old Kang's inner layer were in full contact, and he felt a strong corrosive burning sensation. Chapter 8:11. The stickiness of the inner layer of the fish skin increased rapidly. At first, it only stuck to the flesh and blood of the wound. But soon, the inner layer of the fish skin, which was derived from the living tissues of the mutants, had a strong reaction with his body. The two fused further until it was difficult for them to interact. Old Kang seemed to have heard some kind of high-frequency roar that was full of bloody and violent emotions. Soon, he was also influenced by this emotion. In a trance, the distance between them was blurred. He almost thought that the high-frequency roar came from his mouth. After he got the fish skin equipment, there was a simple instruction manual that stated, "The current situation is that the aberrant features preserved in the fish skin have infiltrated into Old Kang's body tissues with a special technique and formed a temporary aberrant reaction. It's like injecting a wave of adrenaline into Old Kang's body and activating new strength." This strength was not for nothing. It was accompanied by a strong rejection reaction, but it was enough to support him through the rest of the journey, if nothing unexpected happened. Those people in the wilderness really know how to play tricks. Blood continued to gush out of his mouth, but Old Kang felt that his condition was a little better. At least he could use the superiority of a city man to ridicule those who he had never met before. Of course, he was still thinking about the key parameters on the life support system interface. Old Kang had never been to Claw Island before. In fact, among the 4 members of the liaison group, who crossed the ocean to Ban City, the one who had been to Claw Island had already been killed by the military. He could only stumble and fumble forward according to the route and way of passage stored in the chip. He entered the drainage system of the forward base of Claw Island from the periphery of the lake, which meant that he had reached the entrance of the secret passage. The drainage system, which had been idle for many years, had become a gathering area for the rich aquatic species of Beishan Lake. To be more precise, it was the hunting ground of a certain group of mutant fish. This was originally one of the cover of the secret passage. People who were familiar with the situation could use other methods to pass through, but Old Kang didn't have this concept. The aquatic species in the drainage system smelled the abnormal smell of blood. Some fled in all directions and some swarmed forward. Old Kang was not afraid. He twisted his body, which was indistinguishable from a human body and a fish body, slapped and bit and forced his way out. The battle seemed to have injected new strength into him. After forcing his way forward for hundreds of meters, he saw a thick metal gate behind the muddy water in front of him. The purpose of the gate was to prevent the large mutants from invading the forward base on Claw Island. Old Kang's destination was not the forward base, but the side passage near the metal gate. This was installed by the church members of Ban City after the base was abandoned. It could use the base's small drainage system to connect to the large drainage system at the bottom of Beishan Lake, which had already flooded the city. It was a complex and secretive safety zone. Even ability users needed special diving equipment to stay there for long periods of time. Equipped with the fish skin, Old Kong could almost achieve half of his goal as long as he entered the tunnel. Not moving. Amidst the surging mud, broken bones, and flesh at the bottom of the water, a muffled shockwave spread. Old Kong hit the entrance of the passageway. Nothing changed except that the water was more turbid. His authorization chip controlled the fish skin to transmit the signal. It had already connected with the gate of the pathway, but there was no further response. Even though Old Kong had knocked away all the mud and shells wrapped around it, it remained motionless, coldly lying in front of him. The electronic lock had failed. There seemed to be a spare mechanical lock, but the one who was familiar with this place was already dead. sh*t, sh*t, sh*t. Right now, the little bit of energy and consciousness that Old Kong had left was truly not enough to solve such a complicated problem. After continuous setbacks, and also under the continuous attacks of the surrounding aquatic species, the toxicity and rejection reaction of the mutated trait finally took effect. The muddle-headed instincts of a wild beast quickly suppressed the remnants of his consciousness. He cursed loudly, but it soon turned into inarticulate hissing. He was still fighting the school of mutated fish, occasionally releasing high-frequency sound waves. The fish skin had already deeply fused with him. At this moment, Old Kong was like a big fish that had swallowed poisonous bait, struggling at the bottom of the water. His consciousness became more and more hazy. In the end, there was only one thought left. Dig forward. Dig forward. No matter what, dig forward. He gradually stopped paying attention to the fish that were attacking and biting him. Again and again, he hit the entrance of the tunnel and the metal gate. In the muddy water, he kicked up mud after mud. He did not know fatigue or pain. He just wanted to dig through the obstacles in front of him. After an unknown number of collisions, he exerted force once more, but the front was suddenly empty. Not only that, but the tunnel opened underwater and sucked him in. It sucked him into the water and flung him behind the metal gate. He passed. His hazy consciousness suddenly shook, but he was a bit dazed. He seemed to hear a sigh that resembled a human's. Was it a misconception? He quickly tossed it to the back of his mind. Even though he was a bit more clear-headed, he still let his habitual pure emotions take over. Dig, dig. His life as a miner wasn't an experience worth reminiscing about, but he was able to survive. This was an achievement worth being proud of. He had to survive before completing the mission. Just like this, Old Kong entered the deeper layers of the waterway. He entered the ink-stained, pitch-black domain. "How dazzling," said Luonan, who had just returned to the dock. "Mr." Inlu turned her head. She couldn't see any dazzling light source in the pitch-black night. Even the lights on the yacht were quite reserved. Of course, Luonan had always been like this. God knows what sort of wonderful scenery he saw that ordinary people couldn't imagine. Luonan didn't explain, nor did he get on the boat. He just opened up a virtual work area on the dock. He opened up a topographic map of Ban City and its surrounding areas. His fingertips started from the location of Claw Island. He followed a special route and extended all the way to a certain point northwest of Beishan Lake. He asked Inlu and Snake Tongue, "Where is this?" Inlu recognized it with a glance. Mister, this is the fair trade market where the Days Society's processing plant is located. It's also the location of the Ban City Vagrant Exchange. Then what about this place? Inlu was stumped. What's wrong? Inlu couldn't help being astonished. This is the Days Society's processing plant. Did something happen here? Luonan raised his eyebrows and drew a circle around the surrounding area. It shouldn't be a problem to get here in 2 hours, right? Right now? Inlu subconsciously looked at her wristwatch. It was currently 8:22 in the evening in Ban City. It would be almost midnight by the time they arrived at the fair trade market. She was puzzled, but she still quickly guaranteed, "There's no problem. Do we need to contact the Days Society to go to the processing plant?" Luonan finally considered the problem of the sky. Isn't it a bit late? The nightlife of the people of Ban City is quite rich. It's very normal to socialize until midnight, or to start socializing in the middle of the night. Plus, the current situation is special. Ao Ping Rongsan shouldn't refuse. Inlu brought out the level of a secretary and quickly found a reasonable reason for her boss. As for how unreasonable the reason was, she wouldn't even consider it. As for offending Ao Ping Rongsan and the Days Society, this was completely meaningless. Luonan thought for a bit. Let's go take a look at the processing plant. Take a look at the equipment and the technical workers. Inlu first responded yes, then she reminded him. Mr. is going to make an appearance. It's best to take care of your image. It's fine as long as it's passable. If it really isn't possible, then we can borrow Snake Tongue's yarn of invisibility. Snake Tongue slightly bowed to the side. This could be considered a response. Inlu responded again and let Snake Tongue push Luonan onto the yacht. She immediately contacted Ao Ping Rongsan to discuss the itinerary. Under the curtain of night, Old Hand hurriedly walked out of the assembly workshop. His head was lowered, and his already stooped body shrunk even more. His footsteps were hurried, and he was like an old monkey that had strayed from its flock. He was very impatient. He subconsciously tucked his right hand into his sleeve. The warning signal that came from afar seemed to form a high temperature like soldering iron. It made his wrist faintly ache. This kind of warning signal represented that someone had passed through the sluice gate under Claw Island and entered the secret waterway. The sensors installed in the waterway were also continuously positioning themselves and giving warnings. It could be seen from the warning signal that the fish skin was indeed made by him. However, the damage was severe, and the person who came didn't strictly follow the operating procedures. All of this made Old Hand very uneasy. Master Show, the special agent is calling you." His apprentice rushed out from the workshop behind him and shouted, "Say I'm busy." "But, where are you going?" A majestic figure wrapped in a suit blocked in front of him. Okira Rongsan happened to come to this side of the workshop and blocked the person. Old Hand's eyelids twitched. "Io, special agent, hello." Okira Rongsan didn't want to lower himself to his level. He simply said, "The bidder is here to inspect the situation. I need you and I to receive them together. They will arrive in 2 hours." Old Hand blurted out, "Which idiot is coming at this time?" Okira Rongsan glanced at him coldly. For most people, this scar-faced man who used to be the charge leader had a ghost-like murderous aura. However, Old Hand stared back without showing any weakness. An ugly face could be used as capital? He had seen mutant beasts that were 10 times uglier and 100 times stronger in the wilderness. Didn't they all survive? In this factory, Old Hand really wasn't afraid of anyone. He had skills, apprentices, and savings. At the very least, he was 75 years old. For the old man in the wilderness who was suffering from old injuries, it was enough. Could this bunch of Japanese eat him? In the end, Okira Rongsan didn't do anything to him. He patiently explained, "This customer is the most likely partner of the employee stock ownership plan you propose. The other party needs to understand the factory's equipment, personnel, and technical situation. As the workshop supervisor, you are the most suitable person to receive them. Holding shares was to let a group of old brothers and little kids have a foundation to settle down. However, now that danger had suddenly arisen, he didn't have the mood to socialize. Old Hand stiffened his old face and replied stiffly, "My stomach hurts. I want to shit." The Labor Protection Department has gastrointestinal medicine. You have 20 minutes to solve it. Chapter 8:12. About an hour and a half later, Old Hand finally saw the legendary Big Idiot, oh no, the big customer. At this time, Old Hand's heart was already burning with anger. Damn it, it was said that the other side had arrived early. Making people wait for an hour and a half in the middle of the night, Old Hand thought that he was a very ostentatious person. But unexpectedly, only 2 people came down from the luxury yacht that sailed into the dock, and one was disabled. He was pushed down in a wheelchair. It was a man and a woman. The man sat in a wheelchair and looked relatively young, but his specific age couldn't be seen. The woman looked like a white-boned spirit's secretary, and she had a professional and cold demeanor. But in the eyes of Old Hand, this woman was the kind of hypocritical slut. Intentionally or unintentionally, she kept an intimate distance from the man in the wheelchair, as if she was afraid that others wouldn't know. Okurin Rongsan didn't have the cold look he had in the factory, and the lines on his ugly face softened a little. He brought the factory's management and went forward to welcome them. Old Hand followed behind the welcoming team with a straight face, listening to those people's greetings. The man in the wheelchair didn't say much. He only said that his surname was Mo, and it was mainly the female secretary whose surname was Een who spoke. Listening to their background, it seemed that they were also important figures of a certain order, but they weren't from Ban City, but from D City, which was far away. This time, they came to Ban City mainly to make some investment. It sounded quite reliable. After all, they were both in the Pacific Ocean, and the raw and semi-processed products of aquatic mutants on both sides had competition and complementation, so the market was still relatively popular. And the Castle Consortium that Secretary Een mentioned had some brands under it. Even a relatively closed old guy like Old Hand had heard of it. It was a very powerful high-end sports brand, and it matched the main product line of the processing plant. Old Hand had to admit that if it was another time and a different situation, he would be very tempted. But now, the signal from the secret waterway of the old city was constantly approaching, and it made him upset. The speed of the other side was getting slower and slower, and it took a lot longer than expected. Was there a problem? If Old Hand was free now, he would definitely rush into the Beishan Lake to carefully investigate, or to provide support. How could he be like now, wasting time with these capitalists? Especially when he heard Ao Ping and Rong San's suggestion to find a place to have a drink, the veteran's lungs were about to explode. At this moment, the man in the wheelchair, who was only grunting in response, opened his mouth. "We're here tonight because we want to get the right impression of our investment target. I hope that the equipment and technical staff in the factory are in good condition. It's getting late now. Let's go to the factory and discuss on the spot." The other party's meaning was somewhat vague, but his will was very firm, so Aohei Rong San naturally would not refuse. Fortunately, among the crowd, the anger in Veteran's heart was slightly suppressed. The welcoming convoy at the pier quickly turned around and left in a grandiose manner. The Veteran and the big client were not in the same car. He didn't know how they communicated with Ao Ping and Rong San. He could only hold his wrist and force himself to believe that the man in the wheelchair kept his word. The situation seemed to be slowly improving from the worst. The Ping trade market was not the central CBD. The nightlife was not that rich. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the trading center and most of the shops were closed. The location of the day's processing factory was also relatively remote. The journey was smooth, and they returned to the factory in about 10 minutes. The two sides should have communicated again in the car. After getting off the car, Ao Ping and Rong San dismissed the irrelevant people. Only the production and financial supervisors, as well as the veteran, the senior technical staff, followed them. The group went straight into the factory and took a detour along the tour route. The production supervisor probably remembered the words of the man in the wheelchair. When introducing, he specifically said, "The factory's production line is reliable equipment that has been verified for many years. We have also been doing orderly updates and the state is very good. From raw material processing to rough processing, it has achieved automation. There are many types of deformed materials, such as bones, wood, fur, and even flesh. It is difficult to subdivide and coordinate the large and small categories. It is rare to see a similar processing factory like ours." Idiot, that's because the equipment is old and only goes for the low end. The veteran criticized in his heart. This production supervisor was an old member of the day's church. His level was really average. Usually, they almost made him a figurehead. The good thing was that he was relatively peaceful. As long as there were no accidents on the production line, there would be profits every year, and he was willing to be a peace officer. But now he was timid and it made people feel ashamed. The man in the wheelchair obviously did not care about the production supervisor's promotion. He leaned back in his chair and did not look at the tour window. "I want to understand the practical ability of the workers. In this field, the human factor is more important than the equipment most of the time. The practical level of the workers, we are also very good." The production supervisor was already timid. As he spoke, he stepped back and winked at the veteran at the same time. The latter pretended not to see it. Compared to the production supervisor who was eager to complete the business, Ao Ping and Rong San were much calmer. According to the requirements of President Song Ping, the processing factory was not the only business to be dealt with during this period of time. He also had to consider the joint employee acquisition plan of Jiang Zhuang and others. The relationship was complicated, and it could not be rushed. But because of the employee stock ownership problem, in order to make the future arrangements appear more natural, he hoped that the key figure, the veteran, could show his face in front of the investors and leave an impression. Therefore, he also signaled to the veteran to let this awkward old guy take the lead. The veteran was determined tonight, and he still pretended to be deaf and dumb. Ao Ping and Rong San frowned. At this time, Secretary Yin projected a virtual workspace, and a series of data charts appeared on it. She casually scrolled a few times and said, "From the current situation, you have been carrying out customization business, but the performance is not outstanding. With all due respect, in the vagrant exchange and the inner world, this is a very important standard. There is a big difference whether there is unique technology or a well-known craftsman in the industry. Technology and talent need to be more detailed." Ao Ping and Rong San finally said, "Mr. Mo, please visit the assembly workshop. That place uses the most manpower, and it is a relatively core link." The man in the wheelchair asked casually, "Is there a project in progress?" This time, it was Ao Ping and Rong San's turn to be silent. He turned his head and looked at the veteran. The veteran's eyelids twitched, and in the end, he gave in and replied with a hoarse voice, "It's just those routine orders, underwater thrusters, deep diving equipment and so on." "Deep diving equipment?" The man in the wheelchair said a few words and agreed to Ao Ping and Rong San's suggestion. They spent 5 minutes to go to the assembly workshop. Just as Ao Ping and Rong San said, the number of workers in the assembly workshop seemed to be more than the previous workshops combined. Because of the large number of people, even though everyone was in work clothes, and very few people talked back and forth, there was still an atmosphere that was completely different from the cold machine production line, which could be felt through the visitation window. The veteran liked this kind of atmosphere the most. It made him feel like he was back in the wilderness, in a dilapidated cave, assembling those crude but life-saving equipment with his old buddies. The group of guys in the workshop, in groups of 3 to 5, whispering numbers, and coordinating the rhythm, was undoubtedly taught by him. It was old-fashioned and rough, but it was powerful. The veteran unconsciously raised his chest, like a lion patrolling its territory, arrogant. At this time, Secretary Ian flipped through the information and said, "The ratio of the workers employed by the factory is quite high. Hey, city people!" The corner of the veteran's mouth twitched. He had seen this kind of people many times, and now he was too lazy to be angry. On the other hand, Ao Ping and Rong San calmly replied, "Here, they are the main force. That's right, after all, this is the world's largest colony of modified people, and it is also a semi-public experimental base for infected people with mutations. We don't discriminate against this, and investing in the fair trade market can't avoid this kind of thing, but the related labor protection measures must be seriously considered. This is also for the benefit of the workers. A bunch of black-hearted capitalists." The veteran hated this kind of hypocritical tone the most, and simply walked away. At this time, his ears were filled with other voices. "This is the deep-diving equipment that Master Shou mentioned?" It seemed that the man in the wheelchair's curiosity continued until now. When they talked alone, he was quite polite, like a junior, and his attitude was very low. The corner of the veteran's mouth twitched, and it was considered a smile. The man in the wheelchair straightened his back, and his gaze passed through the visitation window to watch the workers operate. The deep diving equipment was a kind of mid-range diving equipment that used various mass-produced parts such as steel, plastic, fabric, and other materials, but they were all in a supporting role. The key was to use the special materials from the aquatic mutants as the axle and to do a good job. The parts were all assembly line products, but the main materials had to take into account the special nature of the material to achieve balance. Every set had a slight difference, so it could only be done manually. The veteran could see that the man in the wheelchair was very serious and methodical in his observation. He stared at a group of people, from the beginning to the end, to understand the assembly process, and then based on the main materials, found the group with the most similar nature, and stared at the whole process. This went on for 7 or 8 minutes before the man in the wheelchair opened his mouth again and sighed. "Very unique design, the combination of practicality and refinement is very good. Is this the wilderness style? It's not even that good." The veteran was immune to this kind of superficial praise. "The molding strip on the back, the wear rate is still high." "Oh, an expert." Just based on the man in the wheelchair's grasp of the nature of the main materials, the veteran knew that this person had a very good eye. But he didn't expect that he also had a way in design. It's inevitable when it comes to force movements, but it also depends on how it is used. It's definitely not a problem to slowly adjust and run in, but young people these days are impatient. Yes, it needs to be done in advance. But in the front, we can do some special refinement and nurture work. The formula technology related to the separation of special characteristics may still have room for improvement. Can you understand it? The veteran's face became solemn, and he thought for a moment before saying, "The formula and craftsmanship are our livelihood. But if we allow technology to invest, everything can be discussed." As soon as the words came out, the veteran wanted to slap himself. So many problems. The man in the wheelchair didn't express his opinion. "I roughly understand. Let's stop here for tonight." Chapter 8:13. That was it? The man in the wheelchair was surprisingly easy to talk to. The task of receiving guests tonight was much easier than he had imagined, which made Old Hand a little uncomfortable. The man in the wheelchair, who was obviously an expert, also left a very deep impression on him. He came and went as he pleased, didn't talk much, and only cared about technical issues. And that pair of eyes. He didn't think much of it at the time, but now that he thought about it, it was like a mirror, very transparent and could reflect some things. He was definitely a capable person, and it wasn't good to cooperate with this kind of person. The other side didn't seem to be too interested, so he could only take it one step at a time. After sending off the man in the wheelchair, Old Hand used the excuse of not having enough energy and asked for a leave from Okurin Rongsan. He returned to his little nest, quickly equipped himself, and snuck out of the peace trade market through a secret route that he had already planned. After making a small detour, he returned to Beishan Lake. The peace trade market was located on the northeast shore of Beishan Lake, which was next to the Misty Mountain Range. If one were to go further into the land, it would be the publicly recognized wilderness. The crust of the islands was relatively brittle, and from time to time there would be volcanic earthquakes, which made the wilderness particularly restless. In addition to the terrestrial species that appeared in the forest, the aquatic species at the bottom of Beishan Lake were also quite irritable. Every year, the peace trade market hunted a large number of mutants for raw materials processing, but at the same time, a large number of human lives were thrown into the mountains and lake. Of course, the so-called human lives had to be discounted in the eyes of some people. The topic that Secretary Een and Okurin Rongsan had discussed was the key. Why did the vagrant tribe of Old Hand come to Ban City? It was because they had suffered from a relatively serious mutant infection, and the tribe couldn't hold on any longer. If they wanted to receive the so-called humanitarian aid from the Star Alliance Committee, the condition was that they had to go to a designated place, sign an agreement, and voluntarily become the relevant living research material. That was the place that Ban City's peace trade market was. On the northeast shore of Beishan Lake, there were dozens of public and private laboratories of all sizes, all of which were doing this kind of work. Every year, a large amount of research funds were invested into it. As for the trade market with the Vagrant Exchange under the sign of the Equal Trade Promotion Association, it was nothing more than the careful and meticulous government merchants of Ban City arranging for the continuous flow of experimental subjects to make a living. He could also earn a small sum of money at the same time, so why not? For example, the Great Zay cult could exchange the experimental resources in their hands and send them to their own factories to work. That would be another wave of income. Back when old Luo was struggling in the wilderness, how could he have received such treatment? He was willing to risk his life with everyone to form a friendship, but look at what happened to him. Therefore, it could be said that the veteran had long seen through it. Perhaps it was because he was old and couldn't stand the torment anymore. Tonight, the veteran had a lot of emotions. All kinds of distracting thoughts only gradually settled down after he dived to the bottom of North Mountain Lake. The signal was still there, but it hadn't moved for a while. The place it stopped at was a supply point in the old city's waterway at the bottom of the lake. The water depth was more than 180 meters. If a normal person did not have special equipment, it would be impossible for them to dive there, let alone stay there for a long time. Veteran looked at his own situation and estimated that even if he was fully armed, he could only stay there for about half an hour at most with the power of his equipment. If the person who came over was still alive, he would have been struggling in the deep water for nearly 2 hours. For such a situation to happen, he was either a strong person with extraordinary physique, or the fish skin I hid at the supply point in the open sea is a scam. The veteran had already prepared for the worst. He went out from a sewage outlet on the shore of North Mountain Lake and dived step by step. When he reached a depth of 60 meters, he activated the underwater thruster and entered the city's waterway at the bottom of the lake. For safety reasons, the annual maintenance of the waterway was personally led by the veteran, so he couldn't be more familiar with it. It only took him about 15 minutes to reach the vicinity of the supply point. There was still a considerable distance before a muffled vibration came from the dark and lightless water. It was intermittent, and in the relatively quiet deep water, it seemed too intense. Of course, there were also mutants in this water area. With such a sound, they had most likely been disturbed. The veteran circled around for a while, but in the end, he gritted his teeth. He held the underwater thruster in one hand and took out the high-pressure gun that was specially used for deep water combat in the other. His speed didn't decrease, but instead increased as he rushed toward the area where the sound was the most intense. By the time he arrived, the situation had already calmed down. The sound coming from this area was muffled, and it was mixed with some fragmented noises. The underwater camera that the veteran was wearing collected weak light, temperature difference, sound waves, and other information in the deep water area. It combined all of these to form a blurry circle of images. This was a concrete building in the old city. It used to be about 7 or 8 stories tall. They could last longer than those steel high-rise buildings. Even after being submerged underwater for 40 years, the external outline still maintained its basic appearance. However, compared to the last time he came here, the middle area of this building had a wall that had fallen off, forming a water vortex that shuttled in and out. When the veteran approached, it gradually calmed down. The speed at which the veteran approached was even slower, allowing the underwater camera to adapt to the subtle changes in the environment. By the time he quietly passed through the gap in the building, he had a relatively clear grasp of the internal environment. A fierce battle had just happened here, and most of the traces had been washed away by the water. However, both sides of the fierce battle were still here. The veteran locked onto the target in the corner. It was a streamlined figure. At first glance, it looked like a large fish that was as long as a person. However, at this time, the skin of this large fish had fallen off in many places, revealing the outline of a human skeleton and some metal-like structures inside. At this time, this half-man, half-fish monster was tightly hugging a giant octopus that was obviously a mutant species. It used both its hands and mouth and fins to tear and gnaw at the octopus continuously. It looked like a beast or a demon. The veteran stared at this scene in a daze, momentarily speechless. When he created the fish skin and placed it in the supply point in the open sea, he had already expected this day to come. Therefore, the instructions were very solemnly written down, the relevant precautions, and indicated the worst consequences. However, he was very clear that when it came to risking his life, these things were nothing. Life, after all, was chosen by oneself. The veteran silently raised the high-pressure gun and aimed it at the figure. If he was already late, the only thing he could do now was to let this person die with some dignity. The other party didn't notice at all, but the veteran hesitated. After all, he still hadn't confirmed the details of the other party's state. Also, although the high-pressure gun was called a gun, its range in deep water was still very limited. He didn't have the confidence to hit it in one shot. After thinking for a moment, he released the underwater thruster and quietly moved forward. Unexpectedly, after advancing a few meters, the person in front of him suddenly turned his head. The bionic fish head that wrapped around the head was already half damaged. In the deep water and high-pressure environment, the exposed face was also highly distorted, and part of it was still stuck to the fish skin. One of the eyes had already exploded, and the flesh and blood were badly mangled. There was still a strip of the mutant octopus's meat hanging from the side of his mouth, making him look as ferocious as a ghost. However, the other party's reaction was unimaginably calm. He just slowly turned around and stayed in place, not reacting to the muzzle that was pointed at him. A glimmer of hope appeared in the veteran's heart. He also stopped, raised the muzzle, and maintained a safe distance. At the same time, he opened his own diving equipment's communication device. He caught the other party's signal and connected. A second later, the communication channel was formed. "Hello, can you hear me? Who are you?" "Heh heh heh." What came through the communication channel was only meaningless throaty sounds and panting, and occasionally 1 or 2 high-frequency screeches. There was no way to analyze it at all. The veteran's heart sank again. It was very obvious that activating the mutant trait within the fish skin and actively forming a mutant infection in order to obtain short-term power had already wiped out the other party's ability to speak. The veteran tried to send a text message, but there was also no response for a long time. This was normal. The mutant infection had already destroyed the other party's nervous system, and his brain function had already changed. It was already quite amazing that the other party could still maintain a relatively clear mind after such a long time. And perhaps this was all he could do. The veteran wanted to slap himself in the face again. This is the good thing you created. Wait a minute, there's still a way, the kind that is often used in educational activities. The veteran tried his best to calm his breathing, concentrate, and use his pitifully weak soul power to sketch out a certain special structure. According to the Church's philosophy, one flower cannot grow into spring, and one tree cannot grow into a forest. Ordinary people without talent could only rely on collective cooperation to survive a great calamity that could come at any time. Only then would they be able to build a shelter for themselves and their fellow believers, huddling together for warmth. The veteran himself did not have the ability to realize telepathic communication, but if the other party was really a member of the Church, the water rippled, and the mutant octopus that had already been torn into pieces smashed over. The veteran was startled, and he subconsciously raised the high-pressure gun again. He quickly came to a realization. With the structure of a mollusk, and the fact that he was nearly 200 meters underwater, it was impossible for him to cause any damage. Furthermore, apart from this throw, the person on the other side only twisted his body in place, stirring up the water ripples. There was no follow-up attack. Then, you won't let me use it? Heh heh heh. Is there danger? Other than panting, there was no other sound, so the veteran knew that he had guessed correctly. But with the current situation, he could not keep guessing. He could not imagine the specifics of the situation at all. What should I do? At this moment, the hideous body in front of him moved, slowly moving forward. The heh sound came from the communicator again. He could tell that the other party was trying to make his voice steady, revealing his desire to communicate. Want to get closer to communicate? The veteran was a little hesitant. That's right, he had joined the Soul Order, but he could not be considered a devout believer. He saw it more as a partner who huddled together for warmth, and this was also in line with the teachings of the Church. Now, he was asked to risk his life. Bah, a man in the wilderness had all sorts of bad habits, except for one, and that was never a coward. The veteran forcibly stabilized his body and watched as the other party approached bit by bit. He also watched as the other party used chaotic and even ridiculous movements to make all sorts of signals. It was very difficult to understand, but the veteran was shrewd and ruthless at this moment. He remembered the experience of learning the sanctuary technique when he first joined the Church. Recalling the scene at that time, he freed a hand and stretched it forward. Just like that, he touched the body in front of him that was neither a human nor a fish. The cold and slippery touch was faintly discernible through the diving suit. However, apart from the simple and crude touch, he also felt a little bit of warmth. It did not belong to the cold and gloomy lake water, but to another world of nothingness. It turned into a warm light and slowly traced a trajectory. Chapter 8:14. The reason why Veteran was called old was that he had reached the age of 80. In today's era, he could barely mix in the ranks of the middle-aged and old, and not completely fall into the circle of the elderly. But in fact, he was still old. Not only did his energy and physical strength decline, but his memory and ability to accept new things had also become worse. It was even more impossible to improve what he wasn't good at before. The mental aspect and soul power had always been his weakness, and it was even more impossible for him to make sudden progress. The warm light from the mental aspect outlined the structure of the trajectory. It didn't seem complicated, but there was a certain requirement for accuracy. And since it was a cooperation, he had to find the right rhythm. Space and time, the multidimensional precision challenge, was very unfriendly to Veteran, and it greatly slowed down his learning progress. Once, twice, 10 times, 20 times. Gradually, counting became meaningless. More accurate, more accurate. Veteran didn't know how long the other person could persist, but when even his own attention began to be exhausted, the other person's state could be imagined. The more it was at this time, the more he couldn't rush. It was such a simple principle, but it was too difficult to do it. Unknowingly, under the diving suit, he was already covered in sweat. Even with the interference of buoyancy and water pressure at the front of his palm, the weight seemed to be increasing. He knew that it was the weight of death. The situation was getting worse. After a series of failures, the light trajectory of the other person's demonstration also had problems. Even a veteran, who was a semi-amateur, could tell that Meng Chao was right. The details were off, the structure was unstable, and the function was not formed at first. There would be 1 or 2 problems in 10 attempts, then 3 or 4 times, and then half and half. Veteran really wanted to shout at the other person. If the F*King shelter can't be built, then it won't work. It's better to find a random god and worship it. Besides, isn't there a design? My ability to read pictures is top-notch. What's the point of doing this mysterious oral teaching? But all the emotions and distracting thoughts settled in front of the other person's seemingly endless demonstration over and over again. Veteran sighed and laughed. Fine, I'll accompany you until I die. I still have this bit of patience. If I can't learn it in the end, go over there and curse me. What he got in response was a breathless silence, another demonstration. But since he had spoken, the veteran had completely let go. He was no longer stubborn. Instead, he supported the person opposite him and searched for a more stable and comfortable position in the sunken building. He leaned against the mottled concrete wall and let his old bones recover. I'm not distracted. I'm just suffocating to death and need a breather. Old people don't use their muscles and bones as their strength. Being able to retract and release them freely is the best condition. Don't blame me. I've been a good teacher all these years, and I can't stop talking. The more I talk, the more spirited I become, and the more excited I become. Just don't let me disturb you. Come, let's continue. The boring study began again, and the mouth of the veteran never stopped. It was like a small wave on Beishan Lake, washing away or at least diluting the taste of despair inside and outside. Time ticked by. Well, you did pretty well this time. I was just a little bit off. Let's continue. You came to find me. Have we met before? After spending so much time together, I do feel a little familiar. You came to find me because you trust me, old show. Don't worry, I may not be as stubborn as you. I'm a little worse in terms of teaching and methods, but my mouth is tight, and I know the word benevolence and righteousness. This time, after learning it, I'll definitely find a trustworthy child to pass it on. Oh, just a little bit off again. Hey! Don't be distracted. Oh, you choked. Come, let me pat you. At least half of your bones have been replaced with steel. Speaking of which, you should be one of the people who came to preach before. I have some impression of you. Forget it, let's not stray from the topic. Let me tell you, there are a lot of good boys and girls in our group. They were all trained in the wilderness. Back then, I followed old Luo for a while, and they were all so arrogant. Your shelter, it's us. This doctrine is quite good, and we all like it. Who can we count on in the wilderness? It's ourselves, and the companions we can trust. With this shelter, the originally illusory things can be quantified, and the efficiency has increased. It's quite good. This is quite similar to what Little Boo said back then. She's a good girl, but good people don't live long. We believe you just because you preach. Do you really think you can spout lotus flowers? In the end, I still feel that it's kind and suitable. It's really suitable, you know? I also used the shelters method to create a purification and tempering method. It's specially used to separate out the mutated characteristics and forge equipment. Here, it's the one you're wearing. It's good, right? It's just that the aftereffects are too great. Look at you, I'll have to think about how to improve it later. You can't be a guinea pig for nothing. Hee, I don't think I should say that. You must be cursing me in your heart. Scammer. The information traveled through the void, and the veteran instantly became speechless. It was also at this moment that a clicking sound came from the nothingness. It was as if the parts were riveted and the modules were connected. From top to bottom, from inside to outside, everything fit seamlessly. It was as clear and refreshing as before. On the mental plane, a simple and clear structure was erected. It was just a combination of basic parts, but it was surprisingly stable. This still couldn't be called a shelter, but the foundation was already under construction, right? The temporary teaching space that was drawn out became turbulent. Countless hazy shadows shuttled back and forth. There was also the clanging of metal and stone, and a hoarse roar. It constantly pounded at the heart and brain, burning hot. The veteran wasn't surprised. He already had a similar experience when he first came into contact with it a few years ago. This should be the accumulated emotions of the other side for a long time. It carried a large amount of information, but unfortunately, he didn't have the ability to distinguish them one by one. He could only watch as they popped like bubbles after a dazzling display. In the midst of this, only a curse was rather clear. Lousy tricks of the wilderness. The veteran quickly reacted and retorted, "TSK, city people. It's rare to see someone like you. Hey, what's your name again? You should at least let people know who this old man screwed over." "TSK, city people are poor and generous." The darkness was still darkness. The dim light from the equipment couldn't penetrate the darkness. The surrounding material environment didn't change at all, but the veteran could see a weak and stubborn radiance extinguish. Half of the support of the nothingness world disappeared. The foundation that had just been erected collapsed, collapsing without a trace. This old acquaintance, who he might have seen before, but he couldn't recognize, had died in the end. The veteran couldn't do anything. He could only be certain that Luo Nan had already memorized the construction drawings of the new shelter in his mind. There wasn't a single mistake. When the color of the sky brightened, Inlo carried a tray of food and quietly arrived outside Luo Nan's bedroom. Snake Tongue was kneeling there in silence. Her posture was refined and steady. It was as if she could maintain this posture forever. She wouldn't feel any fatigue or slack off. After returning last night, Luo Nan had forgotten to return the veil of invisibility to her. So today Snake Tongue appeared in front of others with her original appearance. She had an extremely similar silhouette, but with just a few additions and subtractions, there was a gloomy and cold air that was rarely seen in the Northmont snow drawings. It was hidden in the tips of her brows and the corners of her eyes, causing the surrounding air pressure to drop a bit. Only then did Inlu remember that this was a powerful B-rank power known for being sinister and mysterious. Even though she had the Blood Flame Order behind her back, and had gained many benefits recently, she still wasn't Snake Tongue's opponent. However, Inlu couldn't help but feel a bit of a conquering delight when she saw such a powerful character acting humble and small. She was like this, yet the person in the room was actually able to face her with indifference. She really didn't know what kind of structure his brain had. 100 thoughts spun in her mind, but her face was calm and without a ripple. She spoke in a businesslike manner. "Is Mr. inside?" "He didn't sleep all night. He's probably still drawing." Inlo hesitated for a moment, but she still walked forward. Snake Tongue opened the lattice wooden door at the right time and invited her inside. Luo Nan was still dressed as Boss Missouri from last night in the bedroom. His belt was still untied, and the effect of the veil of invisibility was still there. He sat upright on the tatami, holding an electronic pen in his hand as he faced the virtual work area in front of him. One could see that his eyes were densely bloodshot, and he looked quite tired. His hands didn't make any substantial movements, but he kept on drawing in a small area. It looked like he was a bit excited. But overall, he was just staring blankly. Since she came in, Inla called out softly, "Mister, would you like to have some breakfast?" "Just put it there." Luo Nan responded quite quickly. He clearly wasn't focused or daydreaming. Instead, he was in a state of being overrun with distracting thoughts. Inla could only obey. She and Snake Tongue, who had followed her in, laid out the plates. During this time, she couldn't help but let her gaze drift towards the work area. All she saw were hazy and chaotic lines and blocks of color. It was like a sea, but it wasn't a sea. The general structure was a bit familiar. Right when she was guessing, she suddenly heard Luo Nan's command, "Go find out about the matter of technology investment." Inlu was stunned for half a second. Only then did she remember that the so-called technology investment was something that the awkward old man mentioned last night. She didn't think that Luo Nan would actually take it to heart. "Yes. I'll contact Ao Pingrong and Rong San right now. Or I can directly contact that person." Veteran. Ah yes, the old hand. Luo Nan continued to stare at the work area. He didn't even turn his head. "Also, organize a copy of the Soul Order's information and give it to me." "Yes. That's right. There's also the Deep Blue World. Earth's current development of the Deep Blue World aside from the research projects of the Deep Blue Platform. For example, minerals and the like." Inlu was a bit stupefied. She knew about the Deep Blue World, but this place was only known to people in recent years when the Deep Blue Walkers entered the military. Whether it was the mortal world or the inner world, they knew very little information about this place. The Blood Flame Order didn't have any relevant reserve. Plus, the span of these three commands was a bit large. She was completely unable to grasp the connection between them. Chapter 8:15. Inlu was unable to grasp Luo Nan's train of thought by relying purely on her imagination. She didn't dare to ask any more questions. Suppressing the doubts in her heart, she got up and prepared to do her work. But Luo Nan called out to her at this time, "Hold on. Help me take a look." Luo Nan pointed at the work area. "How do you feel?" It's like the sea, but it's not the sea." Inlu honestly described her previous feeling, including the inexplicable sense of familiarity. Luo Nan nodded. Then he waved his hand, and the chaotic and hard-to-understand scene in the virtual work area before him split into two layers. They peeled off, turning from 1 to 2. So that was how it was. Out of the two paintings, one of them was the source of Inli's familiarity. She had seen it many times. It depicted the storm and thunder on the sea, and the intertwining tornadoes. There seemed to be several powerful forces corresponding to them, and one of them had been erased a few days ago. As for the other one, it should be Luo Nan's work from last night. Inla looked over and couldn't help thinking, this should also be a psychic diagram, right? The structure of the drawing was vaguely Luo Nan's style. The reason why it was vaguely was because of the brushwork, especially the grasp of the shadowy shade. There was quite a bit of difference compared to the concise lines of Luo Nan's sketches. At first glance, his new work looked more like an oil painting. It had a prominent texture, and the layers of dark colors formed the main background of the painting. After the previous overlap, Inlo naturally felt that the painting was showing the bottom of the sea where the light couldn't be seen. The stacked color ripples were the undercurrents surging in the deep sea, giving off a heavy and gloomy feeling that could drown and destroy everything. Inlu soon realized that there was a soft light at the edge of the darkness. The light was so weak that it could easily be mistaken for the projection backlight of the virtual workspace. However, if one were to look carefully, they would know that this was indeed the effect of light and shadow drawn by exquisite brushwork. Part of this beam of soft light scattered in the darkness, and part of it crossed the boundary of the painting. Although it was not completely visible, it still illuminated some things. "What did you see?" Luo Nan's words rang in her ears. Inlu didn't have time to think at all. The words in her heart blurted out, "Light, there are still people struggling." Inlu saw some blurry silhouettes near the gentle light. They looked like people, but they weren't. They existed at the boundary between light and shadow, as if they were using light to dispel the darkness, but also as if they were rushing to a brighter world that was not shown in the picture. The exposed limbs and face were distorted in the light, but the first impression that they gave Lu wasn't ugly. On the contrary, there was a certain tension, which was why she described them as struggling. Afterwards, he forced himself to speak a few opinions, and Luonan finally gave a slight nod in return. Lu naturally assumed that Snake Tongue would also be asked next. She shifted her gaze, but Snake Tongue didn't respond at all. I asked her last night. What she said was similar to what you said. Nothing new. It was a rare negative review, which made Lu feel depressed in her heart. And at this time, Luonan brought up a hand-drawn picture. This picture was even more concrete. She could see the back of a woman at the center of the picture. She seemed to be standing on a beach near the sea. Far away was the exposed silhouette of the upper hull of a ship on the curved surface of the sea. Lu had just come back from the pier of Ban City the day before yesterday. With a glance, she was able to recognize the scattered architectural lines, especially the silhouette of the wing on the high platform. It was no different from the luxurious private business jet parked on the jadeite light. Oh, she seemed to have found another reason why Luonan paid special attention to the jadeite light. She heard Luonan murmur, "I didn't draw it wrong, but there are still links missing in the middle. Too many links are missing. I can't put them together. It's the same even if I add this." Lu immediately imitated Snake Tongue and lowered her head. This was definitely not a field she should meddle in. Reality proved that in certain fields, the method of gathering the masses for mutual benefit was unworkable. Lu and Snake Tongue withdrew one after the other, leaving Luonan alone. He quietly gazed at the three psychic pictures, watching them come together from time to time, piecing together a few seemingly right, yet actually wrong, fragmented illusions. Was he in too much of a hurry? Luonan rubbed the space between his eyebrows, allowing his swollen and aching eyes to ease a bit. Last night, the victim possessed an intense consciousness of a minor. The struggle of the final stages of his life had given Luonan quite a bit of inspiration. Luonan's telepathy followed the minor from beginning to end. At first, it was because the minor had wrapped himself in fish skin and was moving stealthily at the bottom of the lake. He was actually able to hide from Luonan's perception. If the hidden door to the sewage sewer hadn't been damaged and caused a commotion, Luonan would have been completely unaware. Later on, Luonan found it strange that there was such a stubborn and unyielding character in such a notorious and illegal order. Then again, the source of the damage to the hidden door was Luonan. It was caused by the powerful electric field that destroyed the surrounding electronic equipment when he borrowed the help of the biological reactor to repair his cellular tissues. Under the effects of curiosity and guilt, Luonan gave the minor a hand. He helped him break through the checkpoint and enter the old city sewer. Originally, this matter was more or less settled. But Luonan captured the signal waves transmitted by the sensors in the old city sewer. He followed the clues and found the old hand. Things got out of hand from here on. Let's not talk about the emotional level for now. The minor and the old hand exchanged a great deal of information. For example, the shelter. These were things Luonan had never come into contact with before. He had never imagined it. Looking at the shelter from a different angle, what was the difference between it and the Ring of Blood fortress that Luonan had single-handedly constructed? The Soul Order's missionary operation should have already been underway for a period of time. In other words, similar results already existed in this world before Luonan brought out this configuration technology from the virtual brain system. Such high-end technology hadn't even caused a ripple before. It was clearly abnormal. There was also the old hand, an old comrade who had once lived together with his grandfather and the others in the wilderness. This was truly a pleasant surprise. Why did Luonan come to Ban City? Aside from searching for snake tongue and designing a trap to deal with Gong Qi, the other reason was to find Wu Jun. He wanted to find and clarify the relationship between her, his grandfather, and his parent. He wanted to confirm relevant information about the Wilderness Laboratory. He hadn't found Wu Jun yet, but he had encountered a replacement who wasn't inferior in any way. Perhaps this person didn't know the core secrets of the laboratory like Wu Jun did, but listening to the old man talk about a few matters of the past was pretty good, right? If it was possible, Luo Nan wanted to run over right now, grab the old hand, and chat with him for 3 days and 3 nights. In the end, he didn't make the trip. Aside from the current delicate and dangerous situation in Ban City, there was another reason. Luo Nan had gained something from the miner's lesson to the old hand. When the foundation of the new version of the shelter was constructed, there was a brief opportunity for a mental exchange. The old hand's attainments in the mental side weren't enough, so he was unable to read the information within the miner's gushing emotional strength. But Luo Nan was different. Perhaps he could be considered the world's most powerful bystander. It wasn't just in that instant. During the final 2 hours of the miner's life, the miner's hazy yet rich emotional thoughts were reflected in Luo Nan's mind. The destructive mutation infection was an incurable disease that Luo Nan had no way of treating. The only thing Luo Nan could do was to let this tough guy, who hadn't even been able to leave his name, leave a few more traces in the world, even if it was in the memories of others. Right now, there was still the psychic diagram. Luo Nan's gaze stopped on the newest scene of the deep sea. Actually, whether it was Yin Lu or the earlier snake tongue, they were only talking about the part that could be seen. The soft light at the edge of the scene seemed to be a place of light in contrast to the darkness. But in the miner's memories, it was also a place where powerful radiation wreaked havoc. It was a deep-sea furnace that was doomsday-like. It was a place where countless souls struggled and screamed, even though there was indeed the existence of hope within. But what was the more realistic situation? Luo Nan only had the miner's fragmented memories. They were scattered and shapeless. Therefore, he needed the support of other information. Therefore, he wanted to use the psychic diagram to forcefully surmount the barrier of knowledge and extract the most core answers. Reality proved that he was far too greedy. There were far too many missing links in the middle, so much so that the psychic diagram itself was showing a tendency to be edge-shaped. Mr. Bai had once told him that he couldn't force this type of psychic result. Otherwise, his consciousness might fall into nothingness. No matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to fill in that vacuum. Actually, he could fill in a bit more. Luo Nan always felt that there were still some things inside. They already existed, but they were hidden too deeply. Or perhaps the fragments were too severe. The order was completely disrupted. If he could capture a clue to order within the chaos. Luo Nan subconsciously put pen to paper on the virtual work area. He suddenly came back to his senses a few seconds later and looked at the work area. There wasn't any clue on top of the work area. Instead, it was the outline of some world's periphery. Luo Nan's pen technique had probably improved again. A few strokes were already enough to form the appearance of an abyss. It was to the extent that the light in the work area was clearly warped, flickering indefinitely. Sigh. It's best if I don't court death right now. Luo Nan broke out in a cold sweat from shock. He felt weak for a time, so he simply fell back and gasped for air on the tatame. The angle of the light that came through the porthole was leaning to the west. He had unwittingly stayed on the yacht for nearly a day. Things were clearly progressing, but what was with this feeling of not making any progress? A notification from the external neuron vibrated within his brain while he was in a daze. Offline test question database download complete. Luo Nan suddenly sat up. This was much slower than he had expected, but it was still a success in the end. His consciousness immediately moved towards the tree-hole space within the mist maze. He was probably affected by the unforeseen event just now, but he was actually a bit nervous when he cut in. He always felt that the enormous power of the abyss world from the depths of the whistling and rushing sandstorm could crush over at any time. In the past, he felt that it was too far, too chaotic, too ethereal. But now he began to worry about the problem of gravity. Chapter 8:16. Luonan's consciousness entered the virtual brain interface once more. 2 days and 1 night of downloading did not bring about too obvious of a change. There was only a new notification pop-up waiting there, covering the information refresh window. The notification said, "Offline test question database download complete." It seriously lacked a sense of ceremony. Luonan was affected by this and was worried about the gravitational problem of the abyss world. He didn't have any special feelings. He directly chose to confirm. The notification pop-up disappeared and the information refresh window behind it appeared. New but familiar characters appeared. Initiating verification procedure. Confirming activation of offline test procedure. Owner's genetic data has not been entered into the database. Results are being entered. Overall results fail. If he knew that he had to re-enter the questions, he would have taken advantage of these 2 days to do a few more sets of questions and increase his basic points. Luonan chuckled in his mind. Then he saw the follow-up information continue to roll. Additional question database data pulled out. Determining additional question difficulty as spacetime configuration Heaven Stairway Level 2. Selecting questions. Without any buffer, a clear change appeared in the virtual brain interface. The background of the deep starry sky began to expand. The central virtual brain galaxy seemed to come head-on. Millions and millions of stars shuttled and flowed, then scattered in all directions. It represented a process of drawing closer, enlarging, and focusing. The stars became sparse and felt even more distant. A deep void filled most of his field of vision. But soon, the surface was smeared with a relatively rich color. The main source was a large blazing fireball in the distance. Because the light emitted was too intense, it passed through the diffraction and refraction of certain interstellar matter, forming an enormous warped dynamic facula of light. It blurred the proper spherical shape. A portion of its elongated extension was like a spewing light whip and tongue of flame. It cut across a small portion of his field of vision. And so Luonan knew that he should have entered the range of a certain planetary system. He was able to observe the star's sun from a close distance. While he was still analyzing, his field of vision was completely out of his control. He avoided the powerful light of the star and turned in a different direction. A bit of green vaguely sprouted in the void of that position. It rapidly enlarged in the center of the interface. It had a relatively distinct curved boundary. It was clearly a rapidly expanding planet in his field of vision, and it was brimming with the aura of life. It's like playing a game or watching a movie. Luonan couldn't find the feeling of being tested for a time. But it was a bit lacking to say that he was immersed in the scene. The immersive effect was not as good as virtual reality, and his sensory perception lacked real feedback. He knew very well that he was still on the yacht, transmitting information through space and waiting for the test question to appear. While he was pondering and studying, a series of data quickly popped up at the edge of the interface between the habitable planet and the void. The entire field of vision instantly turned into an information window similar to the cockpit. Visualized dynamic information was distributed in the field of vision in a complex and logically connected graphic pattern. From surface data to in-depth analysis indicators, everything was available. At least in Luonan's eyes, this was the case. A lot of the information was filled with symbols and units that he could not understand. They were profound and highly professional, beyond the scope of an intuitive translator like him. If it was a game, the newbie guide was really terrible, but this was a test, the kind that did not bode well. Luonan's scalp was a bit swollen. He was afraid that he would miss out on some important information. He opened his eyes wide and read the decipherable information of the memory information interface in one gulp. And during this process, His field of vision plunged into the atmosphere of the green planet in front of him. The feeling of a game or a movie came again. The image of the planet rotated at an unrealistic high speed, forming a fast-forward effect. At the same time, even more complex information, data, and corresponding analysis diagrams were flung out to the edge of his field of vision. Luonan couldn't keep watching. Luonan waited for the planet's rotation speed to return to normal with great difficulty. Just as he was about to catch his breath and reorganize the structure of information, his passive field of vision was instantly filled with a dynamic image of an explosion. It really was an explosion. What Luonan saw right now was a desperate battlefield. Successive explosions of intense light and raging flames tore apart the primordial greenery and burned half the sky red. Flying targets were shot down every second, and buildings on the ground were destroyed at the same time. Fatal flashes of light and impact crisscrossed between the sky and the ground. Though there was no sound input and it was like a pantomime, this was a war. And at this time, a mission window popped up in an eye-catching position on the cockpit management interface. Compared to the specialized interface that caused people to shrink back, the mission description was quite clear. A high-resolution satellite image locked onto the core region where the flames of war swirled. There was a large base called XX Relay Station. According to the introduction, the complex of buildings on the ground was only a small portion of the base. More facilities were still underground, and the core area was hidden in a special space-time structure that was similar to a demiplane or a space fault. Luonan was able to understand this even though he guessed it. There were many introductions inside that touched upon more specialized domains. Luonan didn't understand half of it. The majority of the information he didn't understand was skipped. All in all, this base was extremely important. It possessed extremely high strategic value. Whether it was a movie, a game, or a test, all of this was necessary. It didn't hinder the understanding of the questions. Luonan carefully studied the key descriptions. The general meaning of the mission panel was, this was an important base sandwiched between 3 layers. The outermost layer was equipped with a XX defensive spacetime barrier. It served as a bunker against external enemies. It could be understood as some sort of enchantment. But right now, the enchantment was on the verge of collapse under the high intensity of the enemy's attacks. Luonan's test question was to take a step further in upgrading the defensive power of the relay station based on the situation of the battlefield and the enemy's strength. He didn't destroy the base's sandwiched 3-layer layout and retained the existing enchantment. The idea of the test was very clear. It was a test of Luonan's space-time configuration design ability. This was a very appropriate test if the questions were examined correctly. Clearly, the Heaven Stairway level of questions were on a completely different level from general knowledge application questions. The practical requirements were extremely high. It was already very close to actual combat. Luonan also discovered during the examination of the questions, other than the intuitive interface of the cockpit management interface, he could also pull up various design blueprints of the base if he needed them. Geological structure diagrams, construction diagrams, and even the core planar configuration design were all there. Luonan skimmed a few glances. There were also all sorts of changes to the infrastructure and the dynamic losses of war. Everything was there. It was simply excessive. It formed a complete historical chain from the beginning of the base's construction all the way until now. Wasn't this test question designed according to actual combat examples? Perhaps there really did exist such a large-scale base at a certain time in the universe. There was such a war. There was such a node that required the contributions of a certain configuration designer. A sense of history assaulted his senses. Compared to this, the lack of authenticity in the senses was secondary. It was reasonable to say that any examinee would have nothing to say when the background information was given to this degree. All they needed to do was bury their heads in research. But Luonan, who had examined the questions twice, looked at the various data and charts that continuously refreshed on the cockpit management interface. He wanted to close his eyes and let out a long sigh. Perhaps the gentleman or lady who designed the test question had thought of everything. The only thing they hadn't considered was that the examinee participating in the test simply didn't possess the corresponding professional knowledge or even cultural background. Even if they did, they would probably only be able to hang around in the general knowledge circle. It was impossible for them to touch upon the heaven stairway level of test. Luonan was an exception. Once again, it was too professional. It was fine to just look at the basic layout and configuration design of the relay station. After all, Luonan had come into contact with a bit of a similar standard composition method in the virtual brain system. Combined with his solid foundational skills, he was able to delve into it with a vague understanding. He felt that he should know how to do it. It was just that he was unable to find a precise place to start in a short amount of time. But the problem was that the test question clearly stated that this test had to be viewed in conjunction with both sides of the offensive and defensive battle. Luonan was on the defensive side, and the external enemy occupied the offensive side. In other words, the enemy he needed to defend against. What the hell was that? There was a mist fortress that was as enormous as a mountain in the air. It was also an unfathomable mist fortress. Lightning interweaved within it as it expanded and contracted. Every time it flashed violently, it would spit out a swarm of bee-like monsters. Among them were air raiders that were similar to prehistoric pterosaurs. They spat exploding acid balls from their mouth. There were enormous rock monsters that were comparable to heavy cannons. They bombarded with death rays from dozens of kilometers away. There were beetle-like assault swarms that could burn parts of their bodies to forcefully break through boundaries and engage in close combat. And there was also the thing that extended out from the mist fortress. It was like a special tentacle. It was indistinct. It pierced through the ground and into the clouds. It could seize the base's facilities and energy at any time. It could even suck combat personnel dry. What was it? Actually, the test system had a label. Every time Luonan's attention was focused on an individual target, the cockpit interface would mark the target's basic information in the form of AR. However, Luonan was unable to understand the concise expression that was composed of professional symbols and measurement units. He looked over and over a few times, but he was only certain that these monsters seemed to be vassals of some fantasy breed. Could it be that it was all an illusion? Luonan understood. Luonan understood. In the eyes of the designer of the test question, the personnel participating in this test certainly possessed the basic knowledge to recognize this type of information. They could obtain comprehensive information from the interface as a reference. The more detailed information was certainly hidden behind professional words and symbols. Perhaps the difficulty of the test question would be completely controllable after integrating and analyzing all the information. But the reality was that Luonan didn't possess this kind of cultural background. The translation function of the secret text of the word me was limited. The information was all intermittent. Plus, the lack of the reality of the scene caused Luonan to only be able to use his sight to distinguish. His most proficient mental senses were completely useless. How was he supposed to take the test? Chapter 8:17. Luonan was a bit flustered. Could he exit right now and go back to rummage through the data of the virtual brain system to cram? Clearly, he could not. After the test questions were presented, a countdown began on the Manage Cockpit interface. Luonan was barely able to convert the basic time units of the mysterious civilization after doing a few simulations. From the pulsating rhythm of the scale, he could tell that he only had around 70 minutes of time. Luonan still remembered that the consequences of failing the offline test was that he would not be able to proceed with a second confirmation for a certain period of time. Luonan could only make blind guesses when it came to the measurement of a longer span of time. Months? Years? Or even longer? The more it was like this, the more he couldn't help but consider the most difficult aspects. Because of this, Luo Nan was exceptionally unable to accept the result of failure. Since he couldn't accept it and he couldn't change it, there was no point in lamenting and regretting. Luo Nan's ability to translate the secret text was basically like this. It was impossible to improve greatly in a short amount of time. Luo Nan could only do his utmost to decipher the information from the data and the images. The data was fine. Even if it was static and unable to reflect the changes in battle, Luo Nan would gain something from reading it a few more times. He would have more ideas. However, the analysis of the battle images was far too unreliable. Luo Nan's military knowledge was lacking. The only things he had were the basic knowledge he learned from crag bursts. Moreover, this level of battle had long since surpassed the scope of Earth's military concept. Luo Nan strove to look at the soldiers hidden within the various bunkers, facilities, and mobile vehicles of the base. They had humanoid appearances that Luo Nan naturally felt familiar with. Most of them wore extremely high-end exoskeleton armor. They were a bit similar to Deep Blue Walkers. Each and every one of them moved quickly, controlled stably, and were well trained. However, a considerable portion of their actions did not rely on the weapons in their hands to carry out direct attack. Often, there would be some sudden, unforeseen attacks and defensive attacks that would erupt within and outside the base. They would appear above and below ground in various areas. At first glance, they didn't seem to conform to the laws of physics, but their destructive power was astonishingly great. This made Luo Nan think of the Deep Blue Walker's formatting domain. He thought of the blood-intent ring fortress that he had built with his own hand. He also thought of the Soul Order's so-called sanctuary. That's right. There was bound to be a clash and a gamble on the mental plane in this battle. If Luo Nan were to extrapolate from the current development direction of the Earth, then there would certainly be one or more collectivized, systemized, and solidified configurations on the mental plane that Luo Nan was unable to perceive. Of course, this was just a guess. No matter how powerful Luo Nan's soul strength was, no matter how high his mental senses were, it was hard for him to create something from nothing. He could probe the existence of the Sea of Consciousness and even the polar domain of the Abyss region from a simulated scene. He could only flip through the information. Now, not only did he have to look through the blueprints of buildings and wards, he also had to find blueprints of the soldier's mental solidification. Unfortunately, there is none. It was still the same problem. The person who came up with the question would not consider things that had already become common knowledge. For an army that had already been established, its solidified configuration should have long since become common knowledge. There was no need to reflect it. However, this was already the only entry point that Luo Nan could exert his strength. Otherwise, what else could he do? The so-called fantasy breed vassal army that blotted out the sky and covered the earth outside of the base. These monsters hid their attacks on the invisible mental plane. There were truly no connections to follow. They became a natural moat that Luo Nan simply could not cross. Time passed minute by minute, second by second. Luo Nan bit his lips as he flipped through all the information he could understand. He did enormous and despairing calculations. Algorithms had never been Luo Nan's forte. When Luo Nan was forced to this step, it meant that he was truly at his wit's end. Dogs hit. It's all dogs hit. Luo Nan took nearly an hour to produce the embryonic form of two plans. However, they were pieced-together results that made him feel nauseous. They were filled with untrustworthy conjectures and fantasies. He didn't even need to submit them. He just needed to do some mental calculations against the battle scenes to prove that they were all trash that could only be of help. He needed to throw them all into the trash bin. Information. Real-time information and information. I don't want anything else. I just want this. Luo Nan's taut strings of reason buzzed and trembled. He tried to find a thread of order that could resonate within the half-hidden sea of information. This was also a conflict between order and chaos. What Luo Nan was doing right now was a vast and exquisite balance that was presented by absolute hell and solar chakram of the abyss world. It was simply the distance between one end of the universe and the other. Wait a minute. Why did he suddenly think of that side? Luo Nan was distracted. His train of thought deviated for no reason. He was clearly struggling within the maelstrom of limited information and infinite chaos, but he inexplicably associated it with the abyss world. He associated it with the solar chakram and absolute hell, mutually conflicting and compromising structures. And it was extraordinarily clear. It was as if it was right before his eyes. Last time, he was in such a state. What followed next was a backlash plus heavy injuries. Luo Nan shuddered. The disadvantages of the non-immersive environment were apparent. He popped out from his focused state and instinctively inspected the state of his body and soul. His body was fine on the yacht. The tree-hole space was still stable at the forefront of his thoughts. Then, the countdown of the administrative cockpit entered a warning orange-yellow zone at this moment. It reminded Luo Nan that the time for him to hand in his test paper was getting closer and closer. Luo Nan gritted his teeth. What was he thinking about? He wouldn't die anyway. At worst, he would just make a trip to Claw Island and update himself. And if he failed this test, he would be unable to increase his privileges. It would be difficult to obtain the encrypted information of the external neuron. The impact was secondary. What was truly unacceptable was that he would miss the window to approach the truth. He would have to start another round of unpredictable waiting. He had to choose the lesser of two evils. If the special image of the abyss world could stir the current deadlock, then there was nothing bad about it. Well, it was impossible for Luo Nan to pin his hopes on another unpredictable factor. He needed to maintain his focus first. Luo Nan slapped his cheeks heavily with both hands and forced himself to dispel all distracting thoughts. He placed his attention back on the virtual war. The information was still as chaotic as before. His agitation and anxiety were still there. But before he knew it, the heat in his emotions and the coldness in his will gradually formed a subtle state of conflict and compromise, just like the conflict between Sunwheel and Hell, and the conflict between the images of high temperature and chains. Between rules and chaos, between reason and emotion, a noose of chains was erected. It endlessly churned and cleansed, maintaining a dangerous yet marvelous dynamic balance. His mind moved and didn't move. It was sharp and clear. The information moved and didn't move. There was order in the chaos. The most important thing was that Luo Nan suddenly discovered a marvelous phenomenon of mapping from the non-immersive test scene. What he saw in his eyes was still the half-cut information that made him restless. There was no sign of things turning for the better even now. It was impossible for the offline test system to provide deeper information. But there was an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. There were some impressions buried deep within his memories that were stimulated by this chaotic information, slowly emerging. Of course, this was an illusion. The true reason was that there was an even deeper and grander system right next to him in a position that was infinitely close. It was in a completely different state from its previous unfathomable and uncontrollable state. It established a connection with the offline test system and began the orderly output of information and data. The abyss world. To be more precise, it was the sediment that Luo Nan was unable to absorb and digest when he suffered the backlash of the abyss world. It accumulated within the altar's spiderweb. In a certain sense, this sediment was equivalent to Luo Nan's own memories. It was just that it was hidden deep within an external storage system that was more complex than the brain. It was simply impossible to dig it out in the past. But now it was activated. The management cockpit continued to pop out analytic graphics without end. Luo Nan continued to not understand the characters he should not understand. But Luo Nan was no longer looking at these scribbles. His gaze fell directly on the panoramic battlefield. It fell on the buildings, the soldiers, and the vassal groups or individuals of the fantasy breed. An even more intense feeling of familiarity burst forth. The old-style defensive array. What was it called? I don't remember, but as a solidified configuration, it should look like this. Magnetite mica. This sort of thing is a large-scale soul magnetization storm of soldiers. Pure defense is definitely not enough. I have to take the initiative to interfere. The design of the enchantment. Crap. I don't have enough time. The timer on the management cockpit entered the red zone. Luonan no longer had the chance to carefully comb through it. However, the experience he obtained from the entire battlefield told him that there was no need to worry. This so-called test was nothing more than a seamless connection between many different types of spacetime structures, seeking a stable and optimal solution. Of course, Luonan knew this. During his battle with Gong Qi a few days ago, especially in the cavern of the Blood God Ants, the Mist Labyrinth, the Blood Soul Temple, and other domain structures interweaved and mixed together to firmly seal Gong Qi within. This was something that had been tested in practice. The structure of the relay station in the topic was a defensive facility. The tightness of the structure was indeed much higher than that of the structures mentioned above. But it was precisely because of its tightness and regularity that the difficulty of Luonan's test was actually a bit lower. Beat. Test time is up. The scene before Luonan's eyes suddenly turned dark. The scribbles on the management cockpit were cleared out. His last impression of the battlefield stopped at the outer perimeter of the relay station. It was the instant the firestorm exploded. The living planets and the model-like stars all disappeared into the distance. Luonan's thoughts returned to the virtual brain interface. A notification pop-up window appeared once more, announcing the test result. This kind of information was quite easy to understand. XX simulation combat test completed. System evaluation. A competent professional. The military's attitude toward you is quite conservative. But blood and fire will help you grow rapidly or die quickly. What kind of score was this? Luckily, the true test results came out. Additional questions offline test result. Pass. Realization of heaven's stairway waiting. The waiting score is incorporated into the general knowledge test result. Applicable to the 100-year sequence special talent clause. Knowledge access level increased. Confirmation of rights review complete. Rank determination complete. Holders' current privileges. Ownership temporary. Knowledge access. Heaven Stairway Level 4 tested. Resource access. Sergeant rank tested. Heaven Abyss Network. None, not connected. Opening corresponding privileges to the database. Able to extract design and craft data of lamination interference. Chapter 8:18. It really wasn't easy. The virtual brain system still remembered this young master's original goal. Luonan was a bit stupefied by the series of evaluations and result. He only came back to his senses when he saw the last sentence. He subconsciously let out a sigh of relief. But when he thought about it in detail, he felt a bit unbalanced in his heart. Of the 4 main authorizations, the Heavenly Abyss Network had been disconnected and could be ignored. The remaining 3, knowledge search and resource transfer, had changed from pending detection to detected. Among them, knowledge search had also been upgraded to Celestial Stairway Level 4. He did a set of Heaven Stairway Level 2 tests and obtained the right to check out Heaven Stairway Level 4. It looked pretty good. Bullshit. The core of the test, ownership, didn't change at all from the word to the meaning. He had been tossing and turning for so long, but in the end, he was still a temporary owner. Someone could point at his nose and tell him to return the item to its rightful owner at any time? What was the use of this sort of confirmation and review process? Luonan cut a sorry figure during the offline test and finally obtained this kind of result. Luonan was quite vexed. However, Luonan was a good and reasonable child in nature. He knew how to look for reasons from himself for everything. After calming down for a bit, He thought back to the entire test process. It really wasn't all that amazing. The final evaluation he obtained was quite conservative. Reality was reality. No matter what objective factors existed, the test evaluation had its own preset standards. Luonan was unable to reason with the system. "Oh, my head hurts." Luonan's mental and physical state began to slide into a low ebb. His results from the low-altitude sweep were just one of the factors. A considerable portion originated from the life-saving mapping during the test. This could be considered a kind of backlash. The amount of information from the sediment was quite large in an instant. Fortunately, it had been washed by the altar's spiderweb, so it was easier to digest than the direct impact of the abyss world. Luonan was a bit regretful. The mapping that was activated during the test formed mostly instant memories. Now that he thought about it, there wasn't much that he could remember. It was a bit like forcefully memorizing a question to pass the test. He had to memorize it in one gulp. He had to come to the question, the situation, and the conditions before he could think of the answer. After the test, everything returned to square one. The sediment continued to precipitate. Perhaps it was waiting for the next stimulus to arrive. After Luonan discovered this, he was unable to inspect his spoils of war. He hurriedly retracted the external neuron and opened up the virtual workspace on the yacht. He took stock of the little bit of memory information that remained. Over half an hour passed. Luonan's head was dizzy and swollen. He looked at the work area again, but the results were few and far between. The relay station was still all right. He had studied the blueprints seriously and had some general ideas. As for the fantasy breed, it was just a fleeting thought. Luonan let out a long and sorrowful sigh. In this way, it would be difficult for him to do a review. In other words, he didn't even know where he went wrong. Luonan's obsessive-compulsive disorder flared up. He competed with himself, tossing and turning in the virtual work area until he was exhausted, but he still didn't make any progress. He had been offline for over an hour. That was about the same amount of time he had spent tormenting himself. Unknowingly, it was already dinner time. Snake Tongue carried a dinner plate and quietly walked in. Luonan came to a realization when he saw Snake Tongue's familiar face. The muslin of concealment was still attached to his body. He had yet to return it to Snake Tongue. Also, the data on the stacking interference technique, which had given rise to all of this, was still lying idle in the external neurons database, waiting for him to read it. What a digression! Luonan mocked himself, but things were already like this. He wasn't in a hurry. He saw that the portion on the dinner plate wasn't much, but it looked like the exquisite dishes of Band City. He really was hungry. He didn't wait for Snake Tongue to finish arranging the food on the plate. He first grabbed a piece of sushi and stuffed it into his mouth. Honestly speaking, he didn't taste much, but the rice ball was quickly digested after entering his stomach. There was a warm and harmonious energy circulating in his stomach. He enjoyed it greatly. It felt similar to the special ingredients of the Xia City branch. It was a nourishing food specially prepared for ability users, but its effects were quite smooth. It was just right for Luonan's current situation. "This isn't bad," Luonan praised. He asked in passing, "Is it suitable for non-ability users to eat?" Snake Tongue sat upright in her seat and responded softly, "Rice is a specialty of Band City's normal trade market. There are indeed health-preserving products specially supplied to the LRCF investment circle." "That's good. I'll be bringing some back to Xia City." "Yeah." Snake Tongue bowed in response. She still had a humble and submissive appearance, but perhaps it was because she lacked the disguising effect of the musket of invisibility. She felt that there was a bit more hidden sharpness to her than when she was in Northmont Xuehui's state. Especially when she lowered her head. The shadows cast by the lamplight just so happened to decorate the lines of her brows and eyes, highlighting her dark and sharp qualities. But it also made her docile and submissive, making her particularly valuable. Of course, this was for Luonan. Luonan's mood suddenly turned for the better by quite a bit. This person, his former enemy, was now his submissive servant. She was clearly a vicious character with a heart like a snake or scorpion, but she was forced to act like this in front of him. Even though she still had pride and schemes deep within her heart, she was like ice shards during the dog days of summer. She couldn't show her face. She couldn't see the light. Luonan could easily need her as he pleased. He could mobilize her joy and fear. He could dictate her life and death. He could browse through every hidden detail. He could even casually smear on them to see a new round of reactions and transformations. Snake Tongue could only passively adapt until she became accustomed to it. Or she could make changes that Luonan permitted. She had already done quite well. After the conversation in the bathroom, her corrections were very clear. She knew better than to look at the problems on the psychological level. She certainly still had some unwillingness in the depths of her heart. Her unruliness was still there. Her lofty and unyielding character still existed. The more it was like this, the more painful it was, but she was able to obtain an unending stream of strength from it. She still lacked a bit of conscious self-awareness up until now, as well as a method to efficiently utilize it. So much so that she had suffered a lot of torment for no reason. Luonan was unable to help her with this. Frankly speaking, he was quite pleased to see Snake Tongue struggle. Cough. Luonan was a bit unaccustomed to suddenly digging out the dark side of his heart. But in this sort of one-sided situation, there was a marvelous calmness that came from letting oneself fly. In any case, his mood had indeed turned for the better. He removed the veil of invisibility from his face and handed it back to Snake Tongue. He even made a joke in passing. "Your acting skills were all trained on Northmontshuhui, right?" Luonan laughed out loud during Snake Tongue's momentary stillness. He pulled out the information related to the lamination interference technology from the virtual brain system. The information wasn't a huge tome, but its form was quite interesting. It was similar to the amalgamation of an experimental diary and a thesis draft. It was a bit messy for other people, but Luonan had a solid foundation in configuration. He also had the mindset of a researcher. The entire research train of thought was simply moved before his eyes. Even though there were a few uncommon characters inside that he was unable to recognize and translate, it didn't affect the overall situation. Compared to the experience of the offline test, it was simply the difference between heaven and earth. Luonan skimmed through the information and had a preliminary understanding of the context of the entire information. He also quickly grasped the crux of a problem. He raised his eyes and saw that Snake Tongue was just about to leave the room. He shouted, "Wait!" Snake Tongue was already Northmontshuhui. She raised her head in a slight daze. Her face was even colder and purer than her original appearance. It intersected with her sinister and malicious image from before, forming a rather large visual impact. Luonan was stunned for a moment before he said, "Stay here. Help me with some experiments." Yeah. According to the information, the veil of concealment and the veil of silence weren't the carriers of the spirit core for lamination interference technology. Instead, they were just extensions. They weren't made of natural materials, nor did they go through any special processing technique. They were just true lamination interference spirit cores. They were in a semi-energized state, absorbing the energy of the outside world over the years to carry out the transformation of mass and energy. They were paired with a small portion of special raw materials to weave themselves into strange objects. According to the information, Mr. Liang Lu's original intention in creating the spirit core was to conceal his identity. Therefore, the combat power of the entire set of objects wasn't that great. This was especially true for the transformation and interference axis of the spirit core itself. It was precise and relatively fragile. It would often disintegrate in battle, and it couldn't be mass-produced. It could only be made according to the specific state of the lamination layer and the user's situation. It was a test of thought and skill. Liang Lu's self-evaluation also said that the relevant design ideas and techniques were actually a level higher than the evaluation of the work. However, the repeatability of the spirit core was far too poor, so it could only reach the 4th level of the celestial stairway. It was a step away from the title of nobility. It was quite regretful that he couldn't leave his name in the annals of history. Luonan didn't quite understand the background of this technology, but he did understand one thing. The product of lamination interference spirit core was a top-notch concealment equipment. If it was operated properly, the user could even change their characteristics in the mental domain, becoming a completely different person. This kind of ability was seriously overflowing. Wouldn't it be too wasteful to use it purely for concealment? The information also said that as a derivative of the spirit core, the dual muslin and the frame of the body and soul must be highly integrated. Otherwise, the interweaving and changing power would injure the user first. This set a very high requirement for the changes, matching, and blending of the user's body and soul structure. The most interesting thing was that the information wasn't limited to the simple pairing of one person and one object. Instead, it was placed on a broader societal level. It researched how to make the characteristics formed by lamination interference approach what kind of person, what kind of person, what kind of standpoint, what kind of person, and what kind of person's faith. This was done in order to obtain the approval of the corresponding circles, to eliminate their vigilance and killing intent. It was simply a teaching syllabus for the study of disguise. Luonan had yet to formally begin, but he already felt that he had learned a lot. At the very least, he knew that the extraterrestrial civilization that Mr. Liang Lu resided in was a complex and turbulent society that could be labeled as a heretic at any time. Luonan also noticed that the information clearly involved the mutual interference of the body and soul, but there wasn't a single word or sentence that involved the words soul strength, mental plane, and the like. The corresponding concepts were all replaced with things like material waves, thought waves, and so on. Translated, this was the meaning. The smell was a bit familiar. Dean Wan? Wasn't this the concept that Dean Wan's order of creation had always emphasized? Chapter 8:19. Hua Dian was the unluckiest person in the world. At least in the 10 days after the 28th of April, Hua Dian firmly believed so. Under the bastard horn demon's terrible ability to control the situation, a routine business investigation suddenly turned into a swing on the line between life and death. The messy arrangements, the baffling traps, the sudden infighting. There were also 2 almighty extraordinaries who had come from thousands of miles away to attach their souls to him. By the time Hua Dian snapped to his senses, he had already been held hostage in the wilderness laboratory and stayed there for 10 days. 10 days was a very long period of time, especially when there was a lack of water and food. Even a superpower would be done for. Hua Dian was glad that every time he went out on a mission, he would prepare emergency energy bars and water replenishment capsules. Over the past few days, he had been frugal and meticulous with his plans. He had finally managed to survive. As for the others, he had to say that apart from him, there was no normal person in the laboratory. Ignoring the 2 who were possessed by extraordinary souls, Jingxin and Horn Demon were 2 dogs in front of a true god. They could live by the whims of others and couldn't be judged by common sense. As for the remaining 2, Hua Dian originally wanted to find a sense of superiority. At the very least, he wanted to experience the feeling of being in the same boat. However, the reality dealt him a heavy blow. Saint Anthony probably didn't prepare enough supplies and ran out of food a week ago. However, he had relied on the pure and rich holy light in his body to mutate and adjust his organs. He entered a state of ascetic cultivation and endured it day by day. Although he was nearly 2 times thinner than before he came in, he was still in high spirits without any signs of fatigue. His mind was even clearer. The one with the surname Wan walked around the laboratory every day, constantly gesturing with his composition. If he was tired, he could squeeze out water from the air to replenish his energy. The more Hua Dian saw, the more she suspected that this guy's mouth could automatically produce liquid food and the like, so that he would never have to worry about food shortages. Against these two, be it in terms of willpower or ability, Hua Dian had no choice but to admit defeat. Worst of all, they were silent fellows. They wouldn't say anything for 2 to 3 days, so there was no way for them to communicate. It bored Hua Dian to death. Perhaps he was only suitable to be a commercial spy, however. It was precisely in such an environment that Hua Dian's sense of crisis was increasing day by day under the encirclement of these people. The big fish ate the small fish, and the small fish ate the shrimp. This was the ecology of the inner world. He wasn't willing to be someone's dog, and his abilities were a notch lower than others. Once he caused trouble, the outcome that awaited him would most likely not be too good. I have to leave. I have to leave quickly. From the first day he entered the laboratory, Hua Dian had never given up on this idea. He had even thought of more than a dozen plans, but none of them were feasible. The regular way in and out of the laboratory was in the hands of Luo Yuan. He had been very easygoing from beginning to end, as if he were there to watch the fun. The question of whether or not to leave the laboratory was completely controlled by the true God. As for the true God, this Almighty who could summon the wind and summon the rain outside, he was willing to stay in this small laboratory because he wanted to dig out the mystery within. At least before the East Ocean auction was held on May 16th, he didn't want to waste a single second. Leave? How could this be? Moreover, Luo Yuan had been saying with a smile that the void environment of the laboratory was unstable. Everyone could be left behind at any time, and it would not be so easy to come in again. Every time he said this, Hua Dian wanted to punch him. He must have done it on purpose, to deliberately provoke him. With the mentality of the true God, the more he heard such words, the less likely it was to leave easily. However, the fact was that they had been here for 10 days, and the entire laboratory was like a small bunker with 1,000 piles. It couldn't be more stable. Even if the sudden storm passed through 2 days ago, causing a certain amount of impact damage to the 2 Kelliser-shaped corridors of the laboratory, the main body of the laboratory was as stable as Mount Tai. Not stable at all. But it was also after that storm that the intensity of the true God's experiment suddenly increased to a level. As the key area of the experiment, the observation hall, Hua Dian no longer dared to approach. The safest thing to do now was to find a room that had not been eroded by the sandstorm and hide in it. But Hua Dian was the kind of person who couldn't stay idle. Just now, he followed Wan Ta and strolled in the right Kelliser-shaped corridor for a while. In comparison, this man, who was said to be a welfare dean in the secular world, was relatively easy to talk to. In particular, some of the outlines he drew often involved the structure of the laboratory, and perhaps the analysis of the sandstorm outside. Hua Dian quietly recorded it, ready to go out as his own harvest, to extort more money from the employer. Wan Ta should be able to detect his behavior of secretly photographing, but he did not stop it, so Hua Dian took it as his acquiescence. After some photographing and collecting, Wan Ta closed his eyes and rested there, adjusting his thoughts. Hua Dian went up to chat with him for a while, but he didn't get the point, so he retreated and walked back along the corridor. Just as he was thinking about where to go, his scalp suddenly went numb. The sound of heavy footsteps came from the front. Because of the curvature, he couldn't see the appearance of the person coming, but his mind had automatically imagined the seemingly sluggish body of the fat dragon. The true God. For 10 days, the true God had been sending his soul to this loyal believer, leading everything in the laboratory. It could be said that he controlled everyone's life and death apart from Luo Yuan. Hua Dian instinctively didn't wish to meet this person. He turned his gaze and saw that the door to a room in front of him was ajar. It hadn't been eroded by the sandstorm. Without thinking too much, he plunged into the room. When he entered, he suddenly thought of a problem. According to the latest popular cage theory, by the time he discovered the true God, he would probably have been in and out several times. Why bother? Huadian froze at the door as Fat Dragon's body slowly walked past him. He didn't even turn his head, ignoring Huadian's existence. Instead, it was Jingxin, who was following behind, who shot a glance over and bared his teeth in amusement, looking very amiable. Damn simp. Huadian didn't have a good impression of Jingxin. This wilderness ecology expert, who held a post in the Ability User Association, had really embarrassed all the technicians in the world. However, he was still somewhat curious. After the two of them walked over, he even poked his head out to take a look. However, due to the curvature of the corridor, he couldn't see the end. He didn't dare go forward either. After poking his head out a few times, he gave up. It was also at this moment that Huadian suddenly felt that something was amiss. He turned his head and saw that in the corner of the empty room, there was someone sitting on the ground with his back against the wall. He didn't seem to have any energy at all. He was like a lump of meat that had been kneaded and thrown there. The lump of meat could still move. Its only arms slid around the ground and walls as it searched. Sometimes it would use its nails to forcefully dig out some powder and place it in front of its eyes. Finally, it would lick it with its tongue or even swallow it. Ugh! Only a horned demon could do such a disgusting thing. Although Horned Demon and Jingxin were the two dogs under the true God's feet, there was actually a difference between dogs. Jingxin was a very competent bootlicker. His only job every day was to serve the true God well. As for the centaur, the initiator of the current situation, after losing an arm, his temperament became more and more weird and gloomy. He did some weird behavior that others couldn't understand. It was appropriate to call him a mad dog. Regardless of what he thought, he had to maintain his dignity. Huadian tried his best to ignore horned demons in human actions. The corner of his mouth twitched as he revealed a smile. Sorry, I didn't know there was someone here. Sorry to disturb you. Something's wrong. Horned Demon's hoarse and dry voice sounded. There were only two people in the room, so it was impossible for Huadian to pretend that it was a misunderstanding. He could only turn his head. What? I'm not in the right state. Nonsense. Believe it or not, my anus can see it. Huadian knew that Horned Demon was messing around again. In the past few days, similar situations had happened to him more than once or twice. It was most likely due to the stimulation he received before entering the laboratory that he couldn't resolve. The two transcendents watched coldly, so it was impossible for Huadian to get involved. He was only thinking that he might suddenly be bitten if he was in the same room as Horned Demon. Huadian had the intention to retreat, so he said with a fake smile, "You're still too tired. Rest a little longer. I won't disturb you." With that said, he turned around and left regardless of Horned Demon's reaction. To his surprise, the moment the door opened, he nearly bumped into someone's face again. Holy sh*t, eh? Dr. Jingxin? Jingxin, who had just passed by, was standing outside the door. He was still smiling and looking very friendly. Looking for Horned Demon? He's inside. Huadian didn't want to deal with such a person at all. He nodded and smiled before turning to the side to walk out. However, Jingxin didn't make way for him. It was also at this moment that Horned Demon, who was sitting on the ground, let out a long sigh. He slowly got up and walked over, saying strange words that no one could understand. That's how it should be. At this moment, Huadian was in no mood to decipher it. As a B-rank ability user, the distance between him and Jingxin had seriously exceeded the normal safe distance. If they happened to meet, it wouldn't be a problem for them to cross paths instantly. However, Jingxin stood there without any intention of making way. Then, the words that came out of his mouth made Huadian's heart sink. "Brother Huadian, Lord True God invites you over." "I'm not going." That was Hua Dian's first reaction, but he didn't have the courage to say those simple words. In that instant, the horned demon behind him swayed as he followed, forming a pincer attack with Jingxin. Furthermore, in the air that he couldn't see or sense clearly, there might be a pair of invisible eyes coldly watching him. Hua Dian gulped a mouthful of saliva. The effects of the rejuvenation capsule seemed to have passed. His throat was so dry that he even cracked his first voice. Okay.